Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we journey back to a place of marble temples and olive groves, where the whispers of philosophy mingled with the rustle of chitons. Imagine yourself transported to ancient Greece, not the sanitized version of textbooks, but a vibrant, often startling reality. You're standing amidst the hustle and bustle of an Athenian street, the scent of roasting lamb mingling with something vaguely floral, and as the sun dips below the Acropolis, casting long dramatic shadows, you can almost hear the low hum of conversation from within the houses. This isn't just about myths and legends. It's about the lives people lived, the secrets they kept, and the desires they pursued. And trust me, some of what we're about to uncover will make your eyebrows do a little dance of their own. You probably won't survive this journey with your modern sensibilities entirely intact, but that's half the fun, isn't it? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to post your location and the local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where you're all tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you step through the imagined threshold of a typical Greek home, a sense of quiet intimacy settles around you, a stark contrast to the public grandeur of the agora or the athletic fields. You quickly realise that much of the intimate life of ancient Greece, particularly its more unconventional aspects, unfolded away from the public eye. While the great thinkers debated virtue in the open and athletes competed in the nude, the true tapestry of their sexual practices was woven in the privacy of homes, in secluded gardens, or within the discreet walls of certain establishments. This isn't to say that the Greeks were prudish, far from it. Their public life was replete with phallic imagery, celebratory processions, and open discussions that might make a modern citizen blush. However, the truly bizarre sexual practices we're about to explore often required a degree of discretion, a shield from the all-seeing gaze of communal expectation. Think of it this way. You wouldn't discuss your most peculiar hobbies in the middle of a busy marketplace, would you? The same principle applied, albeit with different nuances. The oikos, the Greek household, served as the primary sanctuary for family life, and by extension, for many private acts. Within these walls, relationships, both conventional and unconventional, could flourish or falter away from the direct judgment of neighbours. You'd see intricate mosaics on the floors, depicting scenes of myth or nature, perhaps even subtle erotic undertones that were meant for the eyes of the residents alone. This private sphere allowed for a degree of experimentation and expression that simply wouldn't have been tolerated in the public arena. Historians still argue whether the amount of privacy afforded to such practices truly correlated with their societal acceptance or merely facilitated their quiet continuation. Consider the layout of a typical Greek house. You'd enter through a courtyard, often open to the sky, around which various rooms were arranged. There might be a women's quarter, the gynaeconitis, a men's dining room, the andron, and bedrooms, the koiton. The design itself encouraged a separation of spheres, reinforcing the idea that certain activities, especially those concerning intimacy, belonged firmly within the private domain. While public baths and gymnasia were places of social interaction, and yes, even some casual nudity, they weren't typically the stages for the more intricate or ritualistic sexual expressions we're about to uncover. It's like the difference between changing in a locker room and performing a private dance in your living room. One is functional exposure, the other is an intentional act of expression. One mainstream historical fact to grasp is that Greek society was largely patriarchal, with men holding the dominant power in both public and private life. This deeply influenced sexual dynamics. Women, particularly respectable Athenian wives, were expected to remain largely within the home, their lives centred on managing the household and raising children. Their exposure to the outside world was limited, and their sexual agency, at least in the eyes of the law and public discourse, was significantly curtailed. You can imagine the irony here, can't you? A society that celebrated male freedom and intellectual pursuit often confined its respectable women to a life of domesticity, creating a fascinating tension between outward expression and inner constraint. Now for a quirky tidbit. Did you know that some ancient Greek homes had small hidden chambers or alcoves, sometimes adorned with suggestive frescoes, that might have served as dedicated spaces for more adventurous encounters? These weren't necessarily sex dungeons in the modern sense, but rather intimate nooks designed to enhance privacy and, perhaps, ritual. Imagine discovering one of these, tucked away from the main thoroughfare of the house, perhaps behind a heavy curtain, smelling faintly of incense and old oil. It paints a picture of deliberate design for specific private purposes, a world away from the open-air debates of the agora. The concept of modesty in ancient Greece is another area where modern perceptions often clash with historical reality. While they were comfortable with nudity in certain contexts, gymnastics, sculpture, and religious rites, they were also acutely aware of public perception. For a woman to be seen naked in public, outside of very specific ritual contexts, was considered deeply shameful. For men, it depended on the situation and their status. This dual standard meant that intimate acts, especially those diverging from the marital norm, were almost always conducted behind closed doors. You wouldn't find, say, a public display of BDM, though elements of power dynamics and servitude certainly existed within their intimate lives. It's a bit like a secret garden. Beautiful, perhaps wild, but meant for private enjoyment. The importance of the private realm extends to the symposium, that quintessential Greek drinking party. While seemingly a public event, the symposium was in fact a semi-private gathering of elite men, often held in the andron, men's dining room, of a private home. Here, inhibitions loosened with wine, and discussions could veer into more personal, even erotic territory. Though not explicitly a venue for sexual acts, the symposium fostered an environment where sexual expression, desire, and philosophy intertwined. You might hear learned discussions on the nature of eros, alongside playful banter that hinted at illicit affairs. It was a space where the boundaries of public decorum softened, allowing for a more uninhibited exchange of ideas and desires, sometimes leading to more private encounters later on. This blurring of lines between intellectual discourse and carnal appetite is a fascinating aspect of Greek elite culture, a kind of what happens in the andron stays in the andron mentality, but with philosophical footnotes. This emphasis on the private sphere also meant that many of the sexual practices we might label bizarre today were simply part of the fabric of private life for some individuals or groups, rather than widespread public spectacles. We're talking about things that might involve specific costumes, objects, or rituals, none of which would typically be performed on the steps of the Parthenon. The very fact that these practices were often hidden or confined to specific groups makes them all the more intriguing to excavate, like archaeological finds that reveal the secret lives of the ancients. You can almost feel the dust of ages settling as we peel back these layers of time, can't you? The sources for understanding these private practices are often indirect. Vases depicting scenes, fragments of poetry, legal speeches alluding to various behaviours, and philosophical texts discussing desire. You rarely get a direct how-to guide from ancient Greece on their more unusual sexual exploits. Instead, you're piecing together clues, like a detective trying to solve a very, very old cold case. This requires a certain kind of imaginative empathy, an ability to read between the lines and infer the unspoken. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from another story? It's a similar process of piecing together fragments to form a fuller, albeit sometimes murky, picture. So, as we proceed through the coming sections, always keep in mind this fundamental point. Much of what you're about to hear about was either intended to be private, had to be private due to social norms, or occurred within specific controlled environments. The ancient Greeks lived in a society of contrasts, profound public display and profound private discretion. And it's within that latter realm that the truly bizarre, the truly unexpected, often resided. You're entering a world where boundaries were drawn, sometimes rigidly, sometimes fluidly, but always with an awareness of who was watching, or, more importantly, who wasn't. Building on our understanding of the private sphere, you now find yourself drifting deeper into the intimate corners of ancient Greek life, specifically looking beyond the often idealized symposium and into the less discussed world of same-gender companionships. While the symposium itself was a semi-private gathering, it merely set the stage for much more personal interactions, particularly the practice of mentorship bonds. This wasn't just a casual connection, it was often a structured, socially sanctioned relationship between an older man, the Erastes, and a younger man, typically an adolescent, the Eromenos. You might picture scenes from classical art, athletic youths alongside bearded philosophers, and indeed these images often hinted at this very dynamic. The key, however, lies in understanding the layers of social expectation and purpose that often underpinned these relationships, moving them beyond mere emotional closeness in many instances. The mainstream historical fact here is that pederasty was a widely accepted and often lauded practice in many Greek city-states, particularly in Athens and Sparta, though its forms and societal roles varied significantly. It wasn't universally uniform. Each polis had its own customs and attitudes. In Athens, for example, it was seen as a way for older, educated men to mentor younger boys, imparting wisdom, virtue, and civic duty. You'd imagine a young Eromenos learning about poetry, philosophy, and the duties of a citizen, all while developing a bond with his Erastes. This wasn't just about physical attraction, it was about shaping the next generation of citizens. It was a fascinating blend of pedagogy and passion, a concept that likely sends shivers down the spine of modern sensibilities. Now, for a quirky tidbit that might make you tilt your head. In some regions, particularly in Crete, there was a formalised ritual for pederastic relationships. The Erastes would abduct the Eromenos for a period, often to the mountains where they would hunt, bond, and the younger man would receive gifts, sometimes including an ox, a drinking cup, and a suit of armour. Practical items, certainly, but also symbols of his transition into adulthood and his place within the community. Imagine a bewildered parent in ancient Crete saying to their neighbour, "Oh, little Theron's off with Lycurgus in the mountains again. Hope he remembers to bring back an ox this time." It highlights just how integrated and ritualised these practices could be, far removed from modern notions of impropriety. The scholarly debate surrounding pederasty often centres on the extent to which these relationships were genuinely pedagogical versus primarily sexual. Historians still argue whether the paideia, education aspect, was a genuine core component or merely a convenient social justification for what was often at its heart a sexual relationship between men. Was it a noble form of mentorship that included a sexual component, or was the mentorship a veneer for desire? You can almost hear the toga-clad academics of today passionately debating this over Retsina and olives, much like their ancient counterparts might have debated the nature of Eros itself. You must understand that the ancient Greeks had a different conception of sexuality than we do today. They didn't categorize people as gay or straight in the same rigid way. Instead, sexual acts were often viewed through the lens of active versus passive roles and social status. For a man to be the active partner in a sexual act, regardless of the gender of the recipient, was generally considered acceptable and masculine. For a free man to be the passive partner, particularly if he was an adult, was often seen as shameful. This distinction is crucial for understanding the dynamics of pederasty, where the Erastes was always the active, dominant figure, and the Eromenos typically occupied the passive role. The physical aspect of pederasty was widely acknowledged, though often discussed with euphemisms. Plato's Symposium, for instance, famously explores the nature of eros, including homosexual love, often framing it as a path to higher philosophical understanding. However, even in such lofty discussions, the underlying physical attraction is never entirely dismissed. You'd read passages that speak of the beauty of youth, the admiration for athletic prowess, and the desire to possess such beauty both intellectually and physically. It's a complex tapestry where mind and body were often seen as inextricably linked. Consider the role of the gymnasium, a central institution in Greek life. Here, young men trained naked, their bodies honed to athletic perfection. This environment naturally fostered an appreciation for the male form, and it was often a place where Erastai would seek out potential eromenoi. You might imagine an older man observing the young athletes, not just for their athletic skill, but for their physical beauty and potential as companions and pupils. The gymnasium, therefore, served as a kind of public yet private space, where these relationships could subtly begin to form, away from the direct gaze of the household. The social pressure to conform to this practice also varied. In Sparta, for instance, pederastic relationships were seen as essential for military training and fostering loyalty within hoplite units. The bond between an Erastes and Eromenos was believed to make soldiers fight more bravely, unwilling to show cowardice in front of their beloved. You can almost feel the intensity of these bonds, forged not just in shared beds, but in the crucible of military discipline and the fear of battle. It's a far cry from modern army regulations, isn't it? The period of the relationship was also often defined. The Eromenos was typically an adolescent, just past puberty but not yet a full-fledged adult. Once he grew a beard, or reached a certain age, the sexual aspect of the relationship was expected to cease, and the eromenos would transition into adult life, often marrying and having children. This transition was a delicate social dance, where the former eromenos would then become an Erastes himself, perpetuating the cycle. Imagine the awkwardness of running into your former Erastes at the agora, now both older, perhaps with families of your own. "Good day, Theocritus. Still teaching philosophy to the youth, I see." "Indeed, Aristophanes. And your son, has he found a suitable mentor yet?" A polite nod, perhaps a knowing glance. The legal framework around pederasty was also complex. While broadly accepted, there were often laws against exploiting boys, particularly those who were not free citizens, or against demanding payment for such relationships. This highlights a nuanced approach, where the practice was sanctioned, but its abuse or commercialization was not. You wouldn't find rent-a-boy services advertised openly, but rather a more formalized, often ritualized exchange. It's a bit like the difference between a respectful apprenticeship and outright exploitation. One aspect that often baffles modern audiences is the seemingly simultaneous acceptance of pederasty, alongside heterosexual marriage and procreation. For the Greeks, these were not mutually exclusive. A man could engage in pederastic relationships in his youth and throughout his adult life, while also being married and fulfilling his civic duty to produce heirs. Marriage was primarily for procreation and managing the household, a pragmatic affair often arranged for social and economic reasons. Passion and intense emotional connection were often sought elsewhere, whether with other men or with heterae, courtesans, which we'll explore in the next section. You can almost hear a Greek husband sighing, "My wife is good for running the household, but for true intellectual stimulation and companionship, I seek the company of my friends, and sometimes a promising youth." The emotional depth of these pederastic relationships is also a subject of much artistic and poetic exploration. You see it in the works of Sappho, though she focused on female pederasty, or what we might call same-sex mentorship, and in the elegiac poetry that speaks of the bittersweet nature of young love and fleeting beauty. The emotions involved were clearly profound, not just casual dalliances. There was genuine affection, intellectual exchange, and a sense of shared experience that often transcended the purely physical. Remember the idea of eros as a divine madness, capable of inspiring both great deeds and profound feelings? This applied equally, if not more intensely, to these male-male bonds. So, as you slowly emerge from the shadowed corners of the andron and the wrestling schools, you carry with you a more nuanced understanding of pederasty. It wasn't a monolithic practice, nor was it simply about sex. It was a multifaceted social institution, deeply embedded in the educational, military and philosophical fabric of various Greek city-states, shaped by different regional customs and evolving over centuries. You've seen how it blurred the lines between mentorship and desire, between public acceptance and private expression, reminding us once again that the ancient world often defies our neat modern categories. Having explored the nuanced world of pederasty, you now turn your gaze to another fascinating, often misunderstood figure in ancient Greek society, the hetera. Forget the simplistic modern term prostitute, because while heterae certainly engaged in sexual relationships for payment, their roles and societal standing were infinitely more complex and, frankly, quite liberating compared to the lot of respectable Greek wives. Imagine stepping into a bustling Athenian street, past the vendors hawking their wares, and catching a glimpse of a woman with vibrant clothes, perhaps a touch more makeup than was customary, engaging in animated conversation with a group of men. This wasn't a common sight for a citizen wife, but it was perfectly normal for a hetera, a woman who existed in a unique, liminal space between the confined domesticity of wives and the abject poverty of common street prostitutes, pornai. The mainstream historical fact here is that heterae were highly educated, sophisticated companions, distinct from ordinary prostitutes, often possessing significant influence and a degree of social freedom rarely afforded to other women in ancient Greece. They weren't merely sex workers, they were often intellectuals, artists, and talented conversationalists skilled in music, poetry, and philosophy. You might picture Aspasia, the companion of Pericles, who was renowned for her rhetorical skills and intellectual prowess, attracting leading thinkers and statesmen to her salon. This wasn't just about physical beauty, it was about wit, charm, and the ability to engage men on an intellectual level, making them desirable companions for the symposium and beyond. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some hetairai were so famous and successful that they amassed considerable wealth and even had their own schools where younger girls could learn the arts of being a hetaira. Imagine a finishing school, but instead of focusing on needlepoint and managing a household, the curriculum included rhetoric, playing the lyre, understanding philosophical discourse, and, yes, the arts of seduction and pleasure. You might hear whispers of a revered hetaira, perhaps named Phryne, offering lessons in the delicate art of witty repartee, or instructing on the proper way to recite a poem, all while subtly hinting at deeper, more intimate connections. It paints a picture of a formalised profession, passed down through generations, far removed from the desperate circumstances often associated with prostitution. The scholarly debate about hetairai often revolves around the true extent of their agency and freedom. Historians still argue whether their apparent liberation was genuine, allowing them to transcend the restrictive gender norms of the time, or if it was ultimately still a form of exploitation, however gilded. Were they truly independent women shaping their own destinies? Or were they merely a more refined class of commodity, still ultimately dependent on male patronage? You can almost hear the passionate debates in modern university seminars, analysing every vase painting and textual fragment for clues to their true power dynamics. You must understand the stark contrast between the lives of hetairai and those of respectable Athenian wives. Wives were largely confined to the domestic sphere, their purpose primarily to bear legitimate children and manage the household. They had limited public interaction, were generally uneducated beyond basic domestic skills, and their social standing derived from their husband's status. The hetaira, by contrast, moved freely in public spaces, attended symposia, participated in intellectual discussions, and often commanded respect and admiration from influential men. It's like the difference between a cloistered nun and a celebrated salonière, both women, but living in entirely different worlds. The nature of their sexual services was also varied. While physical intimacy was certainly part of the appeal, it was often intertwined with companionship, conversation, and entertainment. A wealthy man might keep a hetaira as a long-term mistress, valuing her intellectual companionship as much as, if not more than, her physical presence. You'd find them at the most exclusive symposia, engaging in philosophical debates with the likes of Socrates, or enchanting guests with their musical talents. They were the life of the party, not just the entertainment. This elevated role meant they could command higher fees and secure more stable, and often more respectful relationships with their clients. Consider the economics of their profession. Unlike the street pornai, who were often slaves or impoverished foreign women selling quick sexual encounters for meagre sums, hetairai were often independent businesswomen. They managed their own finances, owned property, and sometimes even operated their own households, employing servants. This financial independence was a powerful form of agency in a society where most women were legally tied to a male guardian. You can imagine a shrewd hetaira negotiating her fees, perhaps even investing her earnings in property, creating a surprisingly robust economic life for herself. It's a bit like a modern-day independent consultant, but with a classical twist. The legal standing of hetairai was also peculiar. While not citizens in the full sense, most were foreign-born or former slaves, they were also not subject to the same strictures as citizen wives. This liminal status granted them a degree of freedom that was both a blessing and a curse. They weren't bound by the strict codes of modesty and seclusion that applied to citizen women, allowing them to participate in public life in ways that would have been scandalous for a wife. However, they also lacked the legal protections and rights of citizens. It was a trade-off, a form of freedom purchased at the cost of full societal integration. The erotic aspect of their lives, while explicit, was often framed within a context of artistry and pleasure. Ancient Greek poetry and art frequently depicted hetairai, often nude or semi-nude, in scenes of revelry, music, and lovemaking. These weren't necessarily pornographic in the modern sense, but rather celebrations of the human form and the pursuit of pleasure. You'd see images on pottery of hetairai playfully engaging with their male companions, sometimes with explicit sexual acts, but always with a sense of enjoyment and mutual participation, a far cry from the more coercive depictions of enslaved prostitutes. One could argue that hetairai offered a unique form of companionship that Athenian wives simply could not. Wives were chosen for their dowries, their family connections, and their ability to bear children. Emotional and intellectual compatibility were often secondary. Hetairai, however, filled that void. providing stimulating conversation, cultural refinement, and sexual pleasure without the constraints of marriage. You can imagine a Greek husband returning home from a symposium, perhaps a little tipsy, filled with stories and philosophical ideas gleaned from his interaction with a hetaira, knowing he couldn't share such depths with his wife. The most successful hetairae cultivated powerful networks of patrons and admirers, effectively wielding social and even political influence. They could be intermediaries, sources of information, or even confidants for leading figures. Remember Themistocles, the Athenian general? He was said to have consulted with a hetaira on matters of state. It's a testament to their intellectual prowess and their ability to navigate the complex social landscape of ancient Greece. They weren't just pretty faces, they were strategic thinkers, connecting the dots in ways that the cloistered wives could only dream of. Despite their freedoms, it's important to remember that heterae were still ultimately dependent on male patronage. Their livelihoods, and indeed their very existence in the public eye, were predicated on attracting and retaining wealthy clients. This meant a constant pressure to maintain their beauty, their wit, and their desirability. It was a demanding profession, requiring constant self-reinvention and a sharp business sense. You wouldn't see a hetaira resting on her laurels, because the next promising young companion was always just around the corner. The legacy of the hetaira is complex. On one hand, they represent a fascinating example of female agency and influence in a deeply patriarchal society. On the other hand, their existence was still fundamentally defined by their relationships with men and their ability to commodify their companionship and bodies. Historians still grapple with this paradox, trying to understand the true extent of their liberation. Was it a golden cage, or a genuine avenue for self-determination? As you step away from the vibrant world of the heterae, leaving behind the lively symposia and the whispers of intellectual discourse, you carry with you a richer understanding of the varied roles women played in ancient Greek society. The contrast between the confined wife and the liberated hetaira highlights the intricate social fabric, where different paths, however unconventional, allowed for distinct forms of existence and expression. It reminds us that respectability in one era might look entirely different from another, and that sometimes the most interesting stories lie just beyond the traditional boundaries. Having explored the intriguing dynamics of pederasty and the sophisticated world of heterae, you now find yourself delving into a realm where the sacred and the sensual intertwined in ways that might genuinely shock your modern sensibilities. The bizarre sexual practices embedded within ancient Greek religious rites. This isn't about polite prayers or solemn offerings. This is about fertility cults, ecstatic rituals, and the belief that mirroring divine acts, even sexually explicit ones, could bring blessings, abundance, or prophetic insight. Imagine the smoky interior of a temple, not one dedicated to the serene Athena, but perhaps to a more primal deity, where the air hums with anticipation, and the scent of incense mixes with something earthy and animalistic. You're about to witness practices that aim to harness cosmic forces through carnal means. The mainstream historical fact here is that fertility cults and rituals involving overt sexual symbolism, and sometimes actual sexual acts, were a pervasive and accepted part of ancient Greek religion, particularly in agrarian communities and specific mystery cults. These practices were not seen as sinful or impure, but rather as necessary imitations of the creative forces of the cosmos, essential for ensuring bountiful harvests, healthy livestock, and human procreation. You would find phallic processions during the Dionysia, where large erect phalluses were carried through the streets, not as objects of shame, but as symbols of life-giving power and abundance. This open celebration of the generative principle was a far cry from the more restrained religious expressions of later eras. Now for a quirky tidbit that might make you blush a little. In some cults dedicated to Demeter or Dionysus, participants might engage in ritualistic sexual intercourse within the temple precincts or consecrated groves. These acts were not for personal pleasure, but were believed to directly stimulate the earth's fertility, or to commune with the deity's generative power. Imagine villagers, after a long day in the fields, gathering for a night ritual, their faces illuminated by torchlight, believing that their collective erotic energy could coax the crops to grow taller and the flocks to multiply. It's a literal interpretation of as above, so below, where human actions mirrored divine processes. The scholarly debate surrounding these practices often centers on the precise nature and frequency of actual sexual acts versus symbolic representations. Historians still argue whether textual references to sacred marriage or unveiling the mysteries always implied literal sexual intercourse, or if they were often metaphorical, representing spiritual union or symbolic acts. You can almost hear the academic arguments. Was that vase painting a depiction of a real ritual, or simply allegorical art? Did they actually do it in the temple, or just pretend to? This ongoing discussion highlights the difficulty of interpreting ancient religious texts and artistic representations, especially when dealing with such sensitive subjects. You must understand that the ancient Greeks lived in a world where the divine was immanent, not distant. Gods and goddesses were believed to actively intervene in human affairs, and mirroring their divine powers was a way to influence those interventions. Aphrodite was not just the goddess of love, but also of fertility and desire. Dionysus embodied ecstatic release, wine, and the raw, untamed forces of nature, often celebrated with frenzied dances and ritualistic abandon that could easily spill into sexual expression. You'd see ecstatic devotees, both male and female, caught up in the divine madness, their inhibitions shedding like old cloaks. Consider the role of the mystery cults, such as the Eleusinian mysteries dedicated to Demeter and Persephone. While the most sacred rites were kept secret, hence mysteries, sources hint at rituals involving symbols of fertility and regeneration. While direct evidence of sexual acts is scant, the very nature of these cults, centered on life, death, and rebirth, suggests a deep engagement with generative forces, often expressed through symbolic imagery of male and female union. You might imagine initiates, having fasted and purified themselves, being led into a dimly lit chamber where they witnessed sacred objects or dramatic enactments that profoundly resonated with the themes of fertility and creation, perhaps culminating in a symbolic hieros gamos, or sacred marriage. The cult of Dionysus provides perhaps the most explicit examples of sexually charged religious practices. His followers, often women known as maenads, would roam the wilderness in a state of ecstatic frenzy, tearing apart animals and engaging in uninhibited behaviours. While direct textual evidence for widespread ritualistic sex among maenads is limited, the themes of liberation from social constraints, unrestrained passion, and the raw power of nature are undeniable. You can almost hear the pulsating rhythm of drums and flutes, feel the wild energy in the air as devotees abandoned themselves to the primal forces embodied by the god. It was a complete surrender to instinct, a shedding of the civilized veneer. One mainstream historical fact that underscores this is the Panathenaic festival in Athens, where a giant phallus was often carried in procession, symbolizing the generative power of the land and its people. This wasn't some underground cult, it was a major civic event, showcasing the open embrace of phallic symbolism as a vital aspect of public and religious life. You'd see children, adults, and dignitaries all observing, perhaps even participating in, a procession featuring a massive erect phallus, an object that in many modern cultures would be considered obscene, but in ancient Greece was a proud symbol of vitality and blessings. Now, for a truly quirky or fringe tidbit, in some ancient Greek city-states, especially those with strong agricultural roots, there were festivals where men would engage in ritualistic mock sexual acts, with images of fertility deities, or even with the earth itself to ensure a good harvest. These weren't necessarily full-blown sexual encounters, but highly symbolic and often humorous performances intended to awaken the land. Imagine a group of farmers, perhaps a little tipsy, cavorting in a field, enacting exaggerated gestures of sexual union with the soil, all in the earnest belief that this would guarantee a bountiful crop. It bridges the gap between the sacred, the humorous, and the downright bizarre. The scholarly debate on the bizarre nature of these practices often questions whether they were truly seen as sexual in the modern sense, or if the ancient Greeks viewed these acts primarily as symbolic expressions of cosmic forces. Historians still argue whether the participants experienced these rituals as personally gratifying sexually, or if the physical act was merely a means to a greater religious or communal end. Were they experiencing pleasure, or were they channeling divine energy? It's a nuanced distinction, but a crucial one for understanding their mindset. You must also consider the cult of Aphrodite, particularly in places like Corinth and Cyprus. While Aphrodite was the goddess of love and beauty, her cult sometimes incorporated forms of sacred prostitution, where priestesses or temple attendants would engage in sexual acts with pilgrims as an act of worship. These acts were not seen as demeaning, but as a way to honour the goddess and partake in her divine power. You'd imagine a pilgrim approaching a temple, perhaps making an offering, and then engaging with a sacred prostitute, believing that this act would bring them closer to the goddess of love and grant them blessings. It's a concept that directly challenges modern notions of morality and religious purity. The very concept of a sacred marriage, hierosgamos, between a god and goddess, or between a human and a deity, permeated Greek mythology and ritual. These unions, often depicted as intensely erotic, served as archetypes for human fertility and creativity. By enacting or observing these symbolic unions, participants believed they could tap into the same divine generative power. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? It's about a similar belief in sympathetic magic, where imitating a desired outcome helps to bring it about. The integration of sexuality into public religious festivals, like the Dionysia or the Eleusinian procession, demonstrates a society that did not separate the sacred from the sensual as rigidly as many cultures do today. For them, sexuality was a fundamental force of life, connected to creation, abundance, and the very fabric of the cosmos. To deny or suppress it in religious contexts would have been to deny a vital aspect of existence. You wouldn't find protests against these phallic displays. Rather, you'd find widespread participation and acceptance. Even in smaller household cults, you would find altars with small phallic figurines, or offerings made to deities associated with fertility, all intended to ensure the health and prosperity of the family. These domestic practices, while less dramatic than the grand public festivals, reinforced the constant connection between intimate life and divine blessing. You'd imagine a homeowner placing a small phallic charm near their hearth, a quiet prayer for fecundity and abundance. As you step back from these potent and often unsettling rituals, the air still thick with the echoes of ancient chants and fervent whispers, you realise that the boundaries between piety and passion were incredibly fluid for the ancient Greeks. Their bizarre sexual practices, far from being perversions, were often deeply meaningful acts of worship, expressions of a profound connection to the generative forces of the universe. It serves as a powerful reminder that what one culture deems sacred, another might deem profane, and that the human attempt to connect with the divine takes myriad, often unexpected forms. From the earthy, visceral rituals of fertility cults, you now shift your focus to a deity whose very essence embodies the spectrum of human desire and connection, Aphrodite. She wasn't merely the goddess of romantic love. Her influence permeated every facet of attraction, from the sacred to the profane, from procreative urges to the most unconventional passions. You're about to explore the surprisingly diverse and sometimes bizarre cults dedicated to her, revealing how the Greeks channeled their erotic energies through worship, seeking her favour for everything from a fruitful marriage to an illicit affair. Imagine stepping into a temple, not necessarily grand, but perhaps one perched by the sea, where the scent of myrtle and salt air hangs heavy, and offerings of flowers and perfumes are laid at the feet of her statue. The mainstream historical fact here is that Aphrodite was worshipped in numerous forms across the Greek world, each reflecting a different aspect of love and desire, sometimes leading to cult practices that might seem unconventional today. For example, Aphrodite Urania, heavenly Aphrodite, represented a more spiritual intellectual love, often associated with male same-sex relationships and philosophical pursuit, a kind of love that transcended mere physical attraction. Her worship was often more chaste and focused on intellectual companionship. You might find philosophers dedicating odes to her, celebrating the intellectual eros that fueled their quest for knowledge. Now for a quirky tidbit, in some places, particularly on the island of Cyprus, one of Aphrodite's legendary birthplaces, there were rites that involved ritualized sexual offerings or symbolic defloration of young women before marriage. These acts were not considered debasing, but were seen as a way to honor the goddess of fertility and ensure a blessed and fruitful union. Imagine a young woman on the cusp of marriage, participating in a solemn ceremony where she dedicates her virginity, either literally or symbolically, to Aphrodite, believing it would secure her future happiness and fecundity. It highlights a very different understanding of purity and divine favour, where sexual acts could be seen as deeply sacred. The scholarly debate surrounding Aphrodite's cults often centres on the distinction between Aphrodite Pandemos, common Aphrodite, associated with physical desire and popular love, and Aphrodite Urania. Historians still argue whether this distinction represented a true theological division in worship practices, or if it was primarily a philosophical construct developed by thinkers like Plato to elevate certain forms of love. Was there a clear separation in how people worshipped these two Aphrodites in daily life? Or did ordinary Greeks simply see different facets of the same powerful goddess? You can almost hear the discussions echoing through the academic halls. Is this merely intellectual snobbery, or a genuine reflection of popular piety? You must understand that Aphrodite's influence extended far beyond romantic love. She was a goddess of procreation, ensuring the fertility of humans, animals, and even plants. She presided over beauty, pleasure, and allure. This multifaceted domain meant that her cults appealed to a wide range of individuals seeking her blessings for various reasons. A farmer might pray to Aphrodite for a good harvest, just as a young lover might pray for success in courtship. You'd see her depicted with doves, roses, and myrtle, symbols of love and natural fecundity, underscoring her broad connection to life and growth. Consider the role of the Aphrodisia, festivals dedicated to Aphrodite that were celebrated in various Greek city-states. These festivals often involved processions, sacrifices, and in some places, rituals that were more overtly sensual. While not always involving explicit sexual acts, the atmosphere was one of celebration of physical beauty, pleasure, and the joyous aspects of love. You might witness a procession where women adorned in festive garments, perhaps even some heterae, carried symbolic representations of female genitalia, or offered incense that filled the air with seductive aromas, all in honour of the goddess. In Corinth, a city famous for its wealth and its port, the cult of Aphrodite was particularly prominent. Historically, there has been much discussion and debate about the role of temple prostitutes, hierodoulides, associated with her temple there. While the extent and nature of this sacred prostitution are still debated by modern scholars, ancient sources suggest that some women engaged in sexual service as an act of devotion to Aphrodite, and that their earnings contributed to the temple's upkeep. You can imagine a sailor, fresh off a long voyage, entering the bustling city, seeking not just commercial transactions, but also spiritual solace and perhaps carnal comfort at Aphrodite's temple, believing it to be a pious act. Remember the sacred rites we just discussed. This is another facet of that same ancient mindset. One mainstream historical fact that supports the idea of diverse cult practices is the dedication of votive offerings to Aphrodite that explicitly depict sexual organs or acts. These offerings, found in sanctuaries across the Greek world, were not considered shameful or scandalous. Instead, they were sincere expressions of gratitude for blessings received in matters of love, fertility, or sexual health, or as prayers for future success. You'd see small clay models of breasts, phalluses, or even couples embracing, left at her altars by worshippers seeking to honour the goddess for her intervention in their intimate lives. It speaks volumes about the open and pragmatic Greek attitude towards sexuality as a natural, God-given force. Now, for another quirky or fringe tidbit, in some cults of Aphrodite, particularly those focused on personal desires, worshippers might perform rituals involving specific types of food or drink, or even wear particular garments, believed to enhance their attractiveness or sexual potency. Imagine a lovelorn individual preparing a special honey cake offering, mixed with herbs known for their aphrodisiac properties, placing it on Aphrodite's altar while whispering a prayer for their beloved to return their affections. Or perhaps a more elaborate ritual involving the bathing in specially prepared waters, scented with perfumes sacred to the goddess, to imbue oneself with her irresistible allure. The scholarly debate about the temple prostitution in Corinth, specifically, often questions the reliability of the ancient sources, particularly later Christian ones, which might have exaggerated or misrepresented the extent of the practice. Historians still argue whether the numbers of hierodouliae were truly in the thousands, as some ancient authors claimed, or if it was a smaller, more localized phenomenon. You can almost see the modern scholars poring over obscure texts, trying to separate historical fact from moralizing rhetoric. You must remember that for the Greeks, the gods were not necessarily moral exemplars in the human sense. They possessed human passions, including intense sexual desires, and often engaged in complex, sometimes bizarre sexual unions with each other or with mortals. Aphrodite herself had numerous lovers, both divine and mortal. This meant that her worshippers, in seeking to emulate her or gain her favour, might engage in practices that reflected her own divine promiscuity or generative power without perceiving it as inherently immoral. It was an emulation of the divine, not a transgression. Consider the role of charms and amulets associated with Aphrodite. People would wear small representations of her, or symbols sacred to her, to attract love, ensure fertility, or protect against impotence. These weren't just decorative. They were believed to channel the goddess's power directly into the wearer's life. You'd see individuals discreetly wearing a small seashell charm or a tiny depiction of her famous girdle, believing it would enhance their sexual magnetism and ensure success in their romantic endeavours. It's a subtle but pervasive way her influence filtered into daily intimate life. The concept of eros in ancient Greece, encompassing both physical desire and a broader sense of longing, was deeply intertwined with Aphrodite. She was the driving force behind this powerful emotion. When you fell in love in ancient Greece, it wasn't just a personal feeling. It was often attributed to the mischievous arrows of Eros, Aphrodite's son, or to the direct influence of the goddess herself. You'd hear people lamenting their lovesickness, attributing it to Aphrodite's potent touch, a feeling both pleasurable and agonizing, a divine madness. Even outside of formal cults, everyday acts related to beauty, adornment, and courtship could be seen as informal ways of honouring Aphrodite. When a woman carefully braided her hair and applied cosmetics, or a man groomed himself meticulously before a social gathering, they were, in a sense, acknowledging Aphrodite's domain. You might imagine a young woman applying fragrant oils to her skin, perhaps whispering a small prayer to Aphrodite for success in attracting a particular suitor, a mundane act imbued with a touch of the sacred. As you step away from the temples and altars dedicated to Aphrodite, the scent of myrtle still lingering in your imagination, you realise that her worship was as diverse and complex as human desire itself. Her cults provided outlets for a wide array of intimate needs and expressions, from the spiritual quest for elevated love to the earthy pursuit of fertility and pleasure. It highlights how integral sexuality was to the ancient Greek religious worldview, a force to be celebrated, propitiated, and understood as a fundamental aspect of both the human and the divine experience. From the intricate web of Aphrodite's cults, you now pivot to an arena where the body was paramount, celebrated, and yet also subjected to unique, sometimes unsettling forms of display and interaction, the naked games of ancient Greece. Forget the modern Olympic spectacle. This was a world where athleticism and nudity were inextricably linked, revealing a fascinating and occasionally bizarre attitude towards the human form and its potential for both prowess and vulnerability. Imagine yourself standing on the dusty ground of an ancient stadium, the sun beating down, the roar of the crowd in your ears as muscled figures, completely unclad, compete with an intensity that transcends mere sport. You're about to witness how the absence of clothing profoundly shaped their societal interactions and sexual perceptions. The mainstream historical fact here is that male athletes in the major Pan-Hellenic Games, such as the Olympics, competed entirely naked, a practice that was widely accepted and even celebrated as a symbol of purity, strength, and the ideal human form. This wasn't merely a matter of comfort. It was a deliberate choice rooted in religious and aesthetic ideals. You'd see sprinters, wrestlers, and discus throwers, their bodies gleaming with olive oil, completely uninhibited by clothing. This stark nudity was intended to showcase the perfection of the male physique, believed to be a reflection of divine favour and human excellence. Now for a quirky tidbit that might make you reconsider your sportswear choices. Some ancient accounts suggest that athletes would rub their bodies with olive oil not just for muscle suppleness and appearance, but also, in part, as a form of sunscreen, or to deter dust and sweat, which would then be scraped off with a strigil, a curved metal tool, after competition. Imagine the elaborate pre- and post-game rituals, a group of naked, oiled men meticulously scraping themselves clean, perhaps even collecting the sweat and oil in vials, as it was believed to have medicinal or even aphrodisiac properties. It makes you wonder if gym sweat was a sought-after commodity back then. The scholarly debate surrounding athletic nudity often questions its precise origins and the extent to which it was intended to be erotic. Historians still argue whether the practice began primarily for practical reasons, freedom of movement, religious reasons, emulating naked gods or heroes, or aesthetic reasons, showcasing the ideal body, and how much sexual attraction played a conscious role in its development. You can almost hear the academic arguments. Was it about performance optimization, or simply a celebration of the male form for its own sake, with erotic undertones being a secondary consequence? This ongoing discussion highlights the difficulty of separating the practical, religious and aesthetic aspects of ancient Greek culture. You must understand that the ancient Greek appreciation for the male body was intense and multifaceted. It was viewed as a divine creation, a vessel for strength, beauty and virtue. The gymnasia were not just training grounds, they were also intellectual and social hubs, places where older men, erastai, would observe and sometimes pursue younger men, eromenoi, as we discussed earlier. The nakedness in this context fostered an environment where physical beauty was openly admired and discussed, often leading to romantic or pederastic relationships. You'd see men casually conversing, debating philosophy, or simply relaxing, all in a state of complete undress, a level of comfort with the naked form that would be utterly alien to most modern societies. Consider the role of sculpture and art. The ideal male nude, often depicted in athletic poses, became a central motif in Greek art. These sculptures, displayed in public spaces, temples and private homes, reinforced the societal ideal of the naked, athletic male body. These weren't merely artistic representations, they were reflections and perpetuations of cultural values, shaping perceptions of beauty, power and masculinity. You'd walk through a public square and encounter numerous statues of perfectly chiseled naked male figures, a constant visual reminder of the aesthetic and athletic ideals. The social dynamics within the gymnasium were complex. While it was a place of training, it was also a place of display. Young men were aware that they were being observed, not just by their trainers, but by older men who might be seeking a companion or a pupil. This created a subtle tension, a dynamic of being seen and seeing, which naturally had an erotic undercurrent. You can imagine the subtle glances, the quiet conversations, the unspoken admiration that permeated these spaces. It was a unique form of social interaction, deeply entwined with physical appearance and potential intimacy. One mainstream historical fact that illustrates the significance of nudity is that women were generally forbidden from observing or participating in the Olympic Games, especially the men's events. This prohibition reinforces the idea that the male nudity was intended for a male audience and served specific male social and cultural functions, including the fostering of pederastic relationships. You wouldn't find a gaggle of Greek women cheering from the stands. Their presence would have been considered scandalous and disruptive to the sacred nature of the games. Now, for another quirky or fringe tidbit, there are some accounts of women participating in their own separate athletic festivals, like the Heraean Games at Olympia, which were also said to have involved some degree of female athletic display, though perhaps not full nudity. Some speculate that these were less about competitive prowess and more about ritualistic display. Imagine a women-only festival where young women, perhaps dressed in short tunics that exposed their thighs, competed in races, a quiet counterpoint to the male-dominated spectacle, hinting at a parallel, albeit more subdued, celebration of the female form. The scholarly debate about female nudity in ancient Greece is even more fraught. Historians still argue whether women ever competed fully nude in any athletic context, outside of very specific religious rites, or if the evidence is too scant or open to interpretation. The prevailing view is that public female nudity was far less common and more restricted than male nudity, largely confined to goddesses in art or specific ritual contexts where it carried strong religious rather than athletic connotations. You must remember that while male nudity was ubiquitous and celebrated, female nudity, outside of art or specific religious ceremonies, like some cults of Aphrodite or fertility rituals we touched upon, was generally associated with slaves, prostitutes, pornai, or mythological figures. For a respectable citizen woman to expose herself publicly was considered a mark of extreme dishonour. This stark gendered difference in attitudes towards nudity highlights the deeply ingrained patriarchal norms and the different societal roles assigned to men and women. Consider the humorous side of this. Aristophanes, the comedic playwright, often made jokes about male nudity in his plays, sometimes using it for physical comedy or innuendo. The very acceptance of nudity in daily life meant it could also be a source of playful mockery. You might hear a witty dialogue in a comedy, poking fun at an older man's sagging physique in the gymnasium, or a young man's exaggerated attempts to impress his erasts with his physical prowess. It shows that even in serious contexts, the Greeks had a capacity for self-deprecating humour. The practice of competing naked also had a strong connection to the idea of arete, or excellence. To compete naked was to demonstrate one's physical arete, unadorned and unashamed. It was a stripping away of all artifice, revealing the true nature of the individual. This ideal extended beyond the physical. It was about revealing one's true character and virtue through strenuous effort. You can almost feel the intensity of that pursuit, the desire to prove oneself, not just against competitors, but against the ideal of human perfection. Even in philosophical discussions, the naked body was often used as a metaphor for truth and transparency. Plato, for instance, in his discussions of beauty and eros, often linked physical beauty to the pursuit of intellectual and moral excellence. The naked athlete, therefore, was not just a beautiful form, but a symbol of deeper philosophical ideals. Remember the discussions about eros guiding one towards the good. The naked body was part of that journey, a stepping stone towards higher truths. The presence of male nudity in the games also created an interesting dynamic for the male spectators. While they were there to witness athletic prowess, they were also immersed in an environment where male beauty was openly displayed and admired. This would undoubtedly have stimulated same-sex desires for many, making the games not just a sporting event, but a significant social and potentially erotic occasion. You'd see the subtle shifts in focus, from the competitive spirit to the aesthetic appreciation, all unfolding in the stark, unadorned landscape of the stadium. As you step away from the dazzling dusty fields of the naked games, the echoes of cheers and the glisten of olive oil still vivid in your mind's eye, you're left with a profound appreciation for the Greek comfort with the unclothed body. It was a practice deeply embedded in their religious, aesthetic and social fabric, creating a unique environment where athleticism, masculinity and sexuality converged. It reminds us that perceptions of modesty and display are highly culturally specific, and that what might seem bizarre to us was simply natural, even ideal for them. Transitioning from the open spectacle of the naked games, you now enter the more constrained, yet still surprisingly complex domain of ancient Greek marriage. Forget modern notions of romantic love as the primary foundation. Greek marriages were largely pragmatic affairs, often arranged, focused on lineage, property, and the production of legitimate heirs. Yet, within these seemingly rigid structures, a fascinating tapestry of unspoken expectations, covert desires, and sometimes bizarre practices unfolded, shaping the intimate lives of both men and women. Imagine stepping into a bustling Athenian home, perhaps on the day of a wedding, where the air is thick with the scent of celebratory feasts, but beneath the joyous facade you sense a subtle undercurrent of duty, expectation, and perhaps a quiet anticipation of the intimate journey ahead. The mainstream historical fact here is that marriage in ancient Greece, particularly for elite citizens, was primarily an institution for social stability, economic alliance, and the legitimate production of children to inherit property and continue the family line. Love, while not entirely absent, was often considered a secondary, perhaps even irrelevant consideration in the initial arrangement. You'd find fathers meticulously negotiating dowries, debating family reputations, and ensuring that the union would strengthen their social standing, with the feelings of the bride and groom often an afterthought. It was a contractual arrangement, more akin to a business merger than a passionate romance. Now for a quirky tidbit that might make you grateful for modern wedding traditions. The ancient Greek wedding night often involved a ritual called the katechismata, where figs, dates, nuts and coins were showered upon the newly married couple as they entered their marital chamber. This wasn't just confetti. It was a symbolic act to bless the union with fertility and prosperity, invoking abundance and wealth. Imagine the young bride and groom, perhaps a bit nervous, being pelted with dried fruit and small change by their laughing relatives, all in the hope of a fruitful marriage. It certainly adds a unique flavour to the traditional something old, something new idea, doesn't it? The scholarly debate surrounding Greek marriage often centres on the emotional lives within these arranged unions. Historians still argue whether deep affection and even love often develop between spouses over time, despite the pragmatic origins of the marriage, or if the emotional landscape of such unions remained largely detached and formal. Was it a loveless contract that occasionally blossomed into affection, or was it always primarily a duty? You can almost hear the academic discussions. Did the absence of romantic courtship make for more stable, if less passionate unions, or did it simply push emotional intimacy outside the marital bed? You must understand that the age difference between spouses was often considerable. Girls typically married in their mid-teens, sometimes as young as 14, while men married in their late 20s or early 30s. This disparity in age and experience reinforced the patriarchal nature of the marriage, with the older husband taking on a paternalistic role towards his much younger, often uneducated wife. You'd find a young bride, barely out of childhood, suddenly thrust into the responsibilities of running a household and bearing children, a stark contrast to her husband's established adult life. Consider the role of procreation. The primary purpose of marriage was to produce male heirs. A barren wife could be a legitimate reason for divorce or for a man to take a concubine. The pressure on women to conceive and bear healthy children, particularly sons, was immense. You can imagine the anxiety of a young wife, eagerly awaiting signs of pregnancy, knowing her status and future security depended heavily on her ability to fulfill this crucial role. It wasn't just about love, it was about dynastic survival. One mainstream historical fact that highlights the pragmatic nature of marriage is the dowry system. A bride brought a dowry, property or money, from her family to the marriage, which was meant to provide for her in case of divorce or her husband's death. While it legally belonged to her, it was managed by her husband. This system cemented the economic basis of marriage, providing a financial safety net for the wife, while also indicating her family's social standing. You'd find fathers carefully calculating the value of their daughters' dowries, treating them as significant investments rather than simple gifts. Now for another quirky or fringe tidbit. In some regions, particularly Sparta, there were unique marriage customs that involved a form of ritual abduction of the bride. The groom would literally snatch the bride from her home, sometimes in the dead of night, to take her to his house. While perhaps softened by ritual over time, this practice harkens back to more ancient traditions of marriage by capture, and highlights the often symbolic dominance of the husband. Imagine a young Spartan woman, on her wedding night, being kidnapped by her groom, adding a dramatic, almost theatrical element to the solemn occasion. It certainly beats a quiet walk down the aisle. The scholarly debate about the Spartan marriage customs often focuses on the extent to which they reflected true coercive power versus symbolic ritual. Historians still argue whether the abduction was a literal snatching of an unwilling bride or a formalized tradition that, while appearing forceful, was ultimately consented to by both families. Was it a reflection of brute male power, or a theatrical performance intended to highlight the transition of the bride from one household to another? You must remember that while the marital bed was for procreation, it was often not the primary locus of male sexual desire or emotional intimacy. As we discussed, men often sought sexual pleasure with hetirai, pornai, or younger male companions. This created a dual standard. Wives were for the home and heirs, while other relationships fulfilled desires for passion, intellectual companionship, or sheer physical gratification. You'd find a husband fulfilling his marital duties but spending his free time, and perhaps his emotional energy, elsewhere, a common arrangement in many patriarchal societies throughout history. Consider the notion of modesty and seclusion for wives. Respectable citizen wives were expected to remain largely confined to the gynekonitis, the women's quarters, or at least within the household. Their public appearances were rare and often veiled. This seclusion meant that their opportunities for interaction outside the family were severely limited, and their exposure to bizarre sexual practices would have been virtually non-existent, unless they occurred within their own homes. You'd imagine a wife spending her days managing servants, weaving and raising children, her world largely bounded by the walls of her home. The concept of marital fidelity was also asymmetrical. While wives were strictly expected to be faithful, male infidelity was largely tolerated, as long as it didn't involve another citizen's wife, which could lead to serious legal repercussions and public shame. The offspring of such extramarital affairs, particularly if with a non-citizen woman or a slave, were not considered legitimate heirs. You'd find a husband engaging in multiple sexual relationships, all while expecting his wife to remain entirely chaste, a double standard that often led to resentment and tension within the household. One quirky or fringe tidbit related to this. Some ancient Greek medical texts, like those attributed to Hippocrates, contained advice for women experiencing wandering womb, or hysteria. sometimes suggesting sexual activity or even pregnancy as a cure. While not a bizarre sexual practice per se, the medicalization of female sexual function and dysfunction led to sometimes strange recommendations. Imagine a physician prescribing intercourse as a remedy for a woman's inexplicable ailments, believing it would anchor her womb and restore her mental stability. It reveals a fascinating, if misguided, understanding of female physiology. The scholarly debate surrounding female sexuality in ancient Greece often focuses on how little is known about it from women's own perspectives. Historians still argue whether the limited sources, predominantly written by men, accurately reflect the emotional and sexual lives of Greek women, or if their inner worlds remain largely obscured to us. Were women simply passive recipients of male desire? Or did they possess their own desires and agency that we simply don't have access to through surviving texts? You must also consider the lack of privacy within Greek homes compared to modern standards. While rooms were separated, houses were often built around courtyards, and servants and extended family members lived in close proximity. This meant that truly private sexual acts might have been challenging to achieve, leading to reliance on the cover of darkness or careful planning. You'd imagine a couple needing to be discreet, even in their own marital bed, knowing that thin walls or open doorways might lead to unintended audiences. Even within the confines of marriage, some bizarre practices might have emerged due to individual desires or specific family traditions, though these are much harder to document. We know of various sexual practices through literary references or legal speeches, often presented as transgressions. These hints suggest that the full spectrum of human sexual behaviour, including what we might deem kinky or unusual, was present in ancient Greek marriages, even if it was rarely discussed openly or lauded. It's like peeking through a crack in a door, catching only glimpses of a hidden world. As you step out of the domestic sphere of ancient Greek marriage, leaving behind the discussions of dowries and heirs, you're left with a sense of a pragmatic institution, designed more for societal function than personal fulfillment. Yet, within its strictures, and sometimes despite them, intimate lives unfolded, driven by both duty and desire, often finding expression in unexpected and occasionally bizarre ways, reminding us that the human heart and its physical expressions always finds a way, even within the tightest constraints. Having navigated the pragmatic landscape of ancient Greek marriage, you now delve into a truly ubiquitous and often overlooked aspect of their daily lives, the pervasive presence of phallic symbols. Forget any modern sense of prudishness. For the ancient Greeks, the phallus was not just a representation of the male organ, but a potent, multi-layered symbol of fertility, prosperity, protection, and divine power. Imagine walking through a bustling ancient street, past humble homes and grand temples, and encountering an endless array of these symbols, carved into doorposts, worn as amulets, depicted on pottery, and even displayed in gardens. You're about to discover how these seemingly bizarre public displays of sexuality were, in fact, deeply integrated into their religious beliefs, superstitions, and everyday lives. The mainstream historical fact here is that phallic imagery was openly displayed and widely used in ancient Greek society, not primarily for erotic titillation, but as apotropaic, warding off evil, devices, fertility charms, and symbols of Dionysiac revelry and abundance. You'd see massive stone phalluses adorning shrines to Dionysus or Hermes, small terracotta phalluses hanging above doorways to protect the household, or miniature phallic amulets worn around the neck for good luck and virility. This wasn't a hidden subculture, it was a visible, integral part of their public and private visual landscape. Now for a quirky tidbit that might make you chuckle. The ancient Greeks sometimes used phallic representations as wind chimes. Imagine a breeze rustling through an olive grove, and instead of delicate bells, you hear the clinking of small bronze phalluses, believed to ward off evil spirits and bring good fortune to the land. It's a delightful fusion of the practical, the superstitious, and the overtly sexual, turning an everyday object into a constant invocation of fertility and protection. You can almost hear the gentle clink, clink, clink as you stroll through a farmer's field. The scholarly debate surrounding phallic symbols often questions their precise meaning and interpretation in various contexts. Historians still argue whether a specific phallic image was primarily religious, protective, humorous, or purely artistic, as its meaning could shift depending on its placement and the viewer's intent. Was the same phallus on a temple a sacred symbol, while on a comedy mask it was purely a source of laughter. You can almost hear the discussions in ancient pottery workshops. Should this next vase have a subtle phallus, or a truly magnificent one? What message are we sending? You must understand that the phallus, for the Greeks, embodied the life-giving force, the raw generative power that ensured the continuation of life. It was associated with Dionysus, the god of wine, revelry and fertility, with Hermes, the messenger god and protector of travellers, often depicted with an erect phallus, and with Priapus, a minor deity of gardens, livestock and male generative power, whose statues, often comically large phallused, stood guard in orchards and doorways. You'd find these figures everywhere, ensuring prosperity and warding off misfortune. Consider the Herma, stone pillars topped with a bust of Hermes, often featuring a prominent erect phallus. These were placed at crossroads, outside homes and in gymnasia, serving as boundary markers, protectors against evil, and symbols of good luck. Their presence was so common that to deface a Herma was considered a severe sacrilege, as famously happened with the mutilation of the Hermi in Athens just before the Sicilian expedition, causing widespread panic and outrage. You'd pass by these silent sentinels daily, their phallic form a constant reassuring presence, believed to bring blessings and safety. The Dionysia, a major festival celebrating Dionysus, featured grand processions where enormous phallic effigies were paraded through the streets. These were not considered pornographic. They were joyous celebrations of fertility, abundance, and the untamed forces of nature. The parades were boisterous, often involving drunken revelry, theatrical performances, and an uninhibited atmosphere. You'd see citizens from all walks of life participating, cheering on the phallic floats, a public affirmation of life and its pleasures, a stark contrast to modern sensibilities about public displays of sexuality. One mainstream historical fact that highlights the protective function of phallic symbols is their frequent use as apotropaic charms against the evil eye or misfortune. Small phallic amulets, often made of bronze, terracotta, or even precious metals, were worn by individuals, particularly children, or hung in homes and workshops to ward off ill luck and malevolent forces. You'd find a worried parent tying a small phallic charm around their child's wrist, believing it would protect them from harm and ensure their healthy growth. It was a tangible form of ancient spiritual protection. Now, for another quirky or fringe tidbit, Roman authors, drawing on Greek traditions, sometimes describe lamps or oil burners shaped like phalluses, used in homes, particularly in bedrooms. While not exclusively Greek, this practice certainly has its roots in Greek phallic reverence. Imagine trying to read your papyrus scroll by the flickering light of a phallic lamp, or a couple preparing for bed, with such an object casting suggestive shadows. It transforms a mundane object into a symbol of fertility and domestic blessing, adding a touch of ancient bedroom humour. The scholarly debate about the humour associated with phallic imagery is fascinating. Historians still argue whether the exaggerated phalluses on comedic masks or in satirical plays were solely for crude laughter, or if they also carried deeper symbolic meanings related to fertility and social inversion. Was it just a cheap laugh, or was there a more sophisticated layer of meaning related to the power of the primal, even grotesque, life force? You can almost hear the uproarious laughter of the ancient audience, unsure whether they were laughing at the absurdity or in recognition of a deeper, primal truth. You must remember that the Greeks did not separate the spiritual from the physical as strictly as later traditions. The body, its desires, and its reproductive capacities were seen as integral parts of the cosmos, reflections of divine creation. Therefore, celebrating the phallus was not just celebrating sex, it was celebrating life itself, its continuation, and its abundance. You wouldn't find them blushing or averting their eyes. Rather, they engaged with these symbols openly and without shame, seeing them as natural and powerful. Consider the role of Priapus, a god who, while minor, was highly visible, especially in gardens. His statues, often wooden, typically featured a comically oversized and permanently erect phallus, serving as a deterrent to thieves and a blessing for crops. His presence ensured the fertility of the garden and protected it from intruders. You'd find a farmer concerned about his harvest, placing a statue of Priapus prominently in his vineyard, trusting in the god's formidable, ever-ready power to ensure a bountiful yield and scare away any unwanted visitors. The use of phallic imagery also extended to drinking vessels and everyday pottery. Cups might be adorned with painted scenes featuring phalluses, or even shaped like them, used during symposia or other social gatherings. These were not necessarily sex toys, but rather playful, sometimes crude, but always open, acknowledgements of sexuality in social contexts. You'd be sipping wine from a cup, perhaps emblazoned with a humorous phallic design, part of the relaxed, uninhibited atmosphere of a drinking party. The sheer normalcy of these symbols meant they blended into the background of daily life, much like crosses or other religious symbols might in modern societies. They were so common that they ceased to be shocking and became simply part of the visual language of Greek culture. You wouldn't blink an eye passing a herma. It was just part of the streetscape, a familiar sign of protection and blessing. Even in grave markers, particularly those for men, subtle or explicit phallic symbols might be found, symbolising continued virility in the afterlife or the deceased's enduring contribution to their family line. This highlights the deep connection between the phallus and the continuity of life, extending even beyond death. You'd see an ancient tombstone, perhaps with a relief carving that, to modern eyes, might seem strangely explicit, but for the Greeks was a poignant symbol of life's enduring power. As you conclude your exploration of phallic symbols, stepping out of the ancient streets brimming with their omnipresent forms, you're left with a powerful understanding of how differently cultures can perceive and express sexuality. For the Greeks, the phallus was not merely a biological organ, but a multifaceted symbol of life, protection, and divine energy, openly celebrated and woven into the very fabric of their existence. It serves as a potent reminder that what one era considers bizarre, another embraces as fundamental, natural, and even sacred. From the pervasive phallic symbols that dotted the landscape, you now shift your focus to the intricate world of ancient Greek erotic art and its reflection of daily life. This isn't just about marble statues in grand temples. It's about the pottery, frescoes, and small objects that adorned homes and public spaces, openly depicting scenes of intimacy, desire, and sometimes quite explicit sexual acts. Forget any notion of discreet hidden pornography. For the Greeks, the erotic was an integral part of their visual culture, woven into the fabric of everyday objects. Imagine examining a red figure vase from an Athenian pottery workshop, not depicting heroes or gods, but a lively scene of two lovers embracing, perhaps even engaging in a specific sexual position, painted with a frankness that surprises and enlightens. You're about to see how art functioned not just for aesthetics, but as a mirror, a teacher, and sometimes a playful provocateur for their intimate lives. The mainstream historical fact here is that erotic imagery, including explicit sexual acts, was commonly depicted on ancient Greek pottery, particularly on drinking cups, kylikes, and mixing bowls, craters, used in social settings like symposia. These scenes were not considered shameful or illicit. Rather, they were part of the visual repertoire, often serving as conversation starters, humorous diversions, or educational tools about various forms of love and desire. You'd be at a symposium, sipping wine from a cup adorned with a scene of pederastic love or a hetaira entertaining a client, and it would be as normal as a modern-day poster of a rock band in a dorm room. Now, for a quirky tidbit that might make you think twice about your dinnerware, some ancient Greek chamber pots used for urination and defecation indoors have been found decorated with humorous or even explicit erotic scenes on the inside. Imagine using a potty and being greeted by a tiny painted orgy scene. This suggests a level of comfort with sexuality that extended even to the most mundane and private of objects, often imbued with a sense of playful irreverence. It's like finding a modern toilet with a risque cartoon character at the bottom. It makes you wonder about the ancient sense of humour. The scholarly debate surrounding erotic art often questions the intended audience and the precise function of such explicit imagery. Historians still argue whether these depictions were primarily for male viewing pleasure, educational purposes, showing acceptable sexual practices, or had a religious apotropaic function, warding off evil, promoting fertility. Was it merely entertainment, or did it serve a deeper social or ritualistic purpose? You can almost hear the discussions among art historians, scrutinizing every brushstroke for clues about ancient intentions. You must understand that ancient Greek art was not just about beauty. It was deeply intertwined with their understanding of the world, their myths, and their social norms. Erotic art, therefore, wasn't separate from high art or religious art. It was simply another facet of human experience reflected in their visual culture. The frankness of the depictions stemmed from a different cultural concept of modesty and public versus private display. What was often private in terms of act could be very public in terms of depiction. Consider the symposium environment again. These were exclusively male gatherings where wine flowed freely, and conversations ranged from philosophy to politics to gossip. Artistic pottery flourished in this setting. The scenes on the cups and craters were often designed to stimulate discussion, encourage witty banter, and perhaps even inspire certain behaviours. You'd see a group of men discussing a particularly vivid scene on a wine cup, perhaps debating the meaning of the portrayed interaction, or joking about one of their own recent adventures. It was a visual aid for their social and intellectual revelry. The subjects depicted in expressive art were incredibly diverse. You'd find scenes of romantic interaction, often featuring heterae, who were celebrated for their beauty and charm, mentorship-themed scenes between older men and younger boys, and even group depictions or portrayals of specific, perhaps less common, intimate acts. The variety suggests a broad acceptance of different forms of sexual expression, at least in the realm of visual representation, if not always in public practice. You might see a vase detailing a specific intimate embrace, offering a glimpse into the diverse sexual repertoire of the ancients. One mainstream historical fact that underscores the didactic function of erotic art is that many depictions clearly illustrate different sexual positions or forms of sexual interaction, effectively serving as visual guides or how-to manuals. These weren't necessarily for innocent consumption. They provided practical information within a culture where explicit sexual education was not formalized. You'd find a young man perhaps secretly studying a vase painting, learning about intimate acts that might not be openly discussed in his household. Now, for another quirky or fringe tidbit, some very rare examples of ancient Greek erotic art include depictions of bestiality, often involving mythological creatures like satyrs or centaurs. While these were generally restricted to mythical or fantastical contexts and not meant to represent human practice, their presence highlights the boundaries of what was conceivable, even in symbolic art. Imagine stumbling upon a vase painting where a satyr, with his goat-like legs and prominent phallus, is depicted engaging in a bizarre act with a nymph, pushing the limits of even ancient Greek artistic conventions into the realm of the truly strange. The scholarly debate surrounding these more extreme depictions, like bestiality or group sex, often questions whether they were purely mythological fantasy, satirical exaggeration, or hints at actual, albeit very rare, fringe practices. Historians still argue whether such imagery had any direct correlation to actual human behaviour, or if it was simply a projection of primal desires onto fantastical beings. Was it a safe outlet for forbidden fantasies, or a window into the darker corners of ancient Greek sexuality? You must remember that for the Greeks, the line between myth and reality was often permeable. Gods and mythical creatures embodied human passions and actions, albeit on a grander, more exaggerated scale. Thus, the erotic escapades of Zeus or the lustful antics of satyrs could be depicted without shame, as they reflected fundamental aspects of human nature. You wouldn't find them censoring these myths. Instead, they were integral to their understanding of the world and themselves. Consider the role of small terracotta figurines. These were often found in homes, sanctuaries, and graves, and many depicted explicit sexual acts or exaggerated genitalia. They could serve as votive offerings, fertility charms, or even as personal objects for private contemplation. You'd find a small hand-sized figurine depicting a couple in a tender embrace, or a more overtly explicit scene, tucked away in a personal chest or placed on a domestic altar, used for private devotion or personal pleasure. The materials used for erotic art also varied. Beyond pottery, you'd find frescoes in private homes, though rarer for the explicit kind than in Roman Pompeii. Metal objects, gems, and even coins with subtle or overt erotic symbolism. This widespread use across different media demonstrates how deeply embedded eroticism was in their visual culture, making it impossible to avoid if you were living in ancient Greece. You wouldn't just see it in museums, you'd encounter it in your everyday interactions with objects. The humour in ancient Greek erotic art is another key aspect. Many scenes are not solemn but playful, even comedic. Exaggerated features, absurd situations, and light-hearted interactions are common, suggesting that sexual themes were often approached with levity and wit. Remember the chamber pot. It's part of this larger tradition of incorporating humour into even the most intimate spheres of life. You'd chuckle at a vase painting depicting an older man comically failing in his amorous pursuits, or a satyr with an absurdly large erection, all part of the shared humour of the symposium. The lack of shame associated with these depictions stands in stark contrast to many later Western cultures. The Greeks simply did not share the same concept of original sin, or the inherent sinfulness of the body. For them, sexuality was a natural, often joyous, and sometimes sacred part of life. To depict it was merely to represent reality, human nature, and the divine forces that governed desire. You wouldn't find public outcry against such art. Instead, it was admired for its skill and its directness. Even children would have been exposed to some of this imagery, perhaps not the most detailed, but certainly the omnipresent symbolic figures, and perhaps some of the more playful thematic scenes on everyday objects. This early exposure would have normalised many aspects of human behaviour from a young age, shaping their understanding of the body and its nature from a very early point. You can imagine a child pointing at a vase painting and asking their parent, "Mama, what are those people doing?" and receiving a matter-of-fact, perhaps even humorous explanation. As you step away from the vibrant, often bold, world of ancient Greek expressive art, leaving behind the lively symposium scenes and the suggestive chamber pots, you're left with a powerful impression of a culture that embraced human expression with remarkable openness. Their art wasn't just decorative, it was a mirror to their values, their humour, and their profound comfort with the human form in all its aspects. It serves as a striking reminder that taboos and modesty are cultural constructs, and that in ancient Greece, the erotic was very much a part of the visible, celebrated fabric of daily life. From the vibrant, often explicit world of ancient Greek erotic art, you now ascend into the realm of the divine, a landscape populated by gods and goddesses whose passions, desires, and intimate encounters often mirrored, and sometimes wildly exaggerated, those of mortals. Forget any notion of serene, morally upright deities. The Olympian pantheon was a chaotic, often amoral, collection of powerful beings whose sexual escapades, both consensual and non-consensual, formed the bedrock of their mythology and profoundly influenced human perceptions of sexuality. Imagine standing at the foot of Mount Olympus, looking up at the swirling clouds, knowing that within that ethereal domain, Zeus, Hera, and their divine kin were engaging in intimate dramas that shaped the very fabric of the cosmos. You're about to explore the bizarre sexual unions of the gods, revealing how their divine promiscuity and often coercive acts provided both entertainment and a framework for understanding human desire. The mainstream historical fact here is that ancient Greek mythology is replete with tales of gods engaging in numerous sexual unions, often with mortals, and frequently involving deception, disguise, or outright coercion, reflecting a divine morality that was often starkly different from human ethical standards. Zeus, the king of the gods, was particularly notorious for his countless affairs and seductions, transforming himself into animals, gold, or even a shower of rain to approach mortal women. You'd hear tales of Leda and the swan, Europa and the bull, or Danae and the golden shower, all thinly veiled accounts of divine sexual predation. These myths were not condemned. They were foundational stories, recited and depicted, forming part of the cultural tapestry. Now for a quirky tidbit that might make you question divine family values. Zeus, the supreme god, was married to his sister, Hera, who was also his half-sister, as they were both children of Cronus and Rhea. And their marriage, despite its incestuous origins, was a tumultuous affair marked by Hera's vengeful jealousy over Zeus's endless infidelities. Imagine the ultimate family drama playing out on a cosmic scale, with divine siblings locked in a never-ending cycle of passion, betrayal, and cosmic arguments. It's certainly a unique spin on keeping it in the family, isn't it? The scholarly debate surrounding the sexual acts of the gods often questions the extent to which these myths served as justifications for human behaviours or merely as fantastical narratives. Historians still argue whether the stories of divine rape or incest reflected an acceptance of such acts in human society, or if they were seen as distinctly divine behaviours that highlighted the gods' immense power and disregard for human morality. Were these cautionary tales or tacit endorsements? You can almost hear the ancient philosophers debating the morality of Zeus's actions, trying to reconcile divine power with human concepts of justice. You must understand that the ancient Greeks did not expect their gods to be moral paragons in the way that later monotheistic religions would. The gods were powerful, immortal beings who embodied various forces of nature and human passion. Their actions, however bizarre or immoral by human standards, were seen as demonstrations of their power and their unpredictable nature. They were forces to be reckoned with, propitiated and understood, not necessarily emulated in every detail. You'd respect Zeus's power, even as you sympathised with Hera's plight or shuddered at his predatory nature. Consider the pervasive theme of divine shapeshifting for sexual encounters. Zeus was the master of this, transforming into various animals or natural phenomena to approach mortal women or goddesses. This bizarre practice allowed him to bypass mortal defences, enter forbidden spaces, or simply add an element of exoticism to his conquests. You'd hear a myth about a god disguising himself as a humble shepherd to seduce a nymph, or a goddess transforming into a bird to escape an unwanted suitor, highlighting the fluidity of form and the omnipresence of desire in the divine realm. The concept of divine fertility was also closely tied to these sexual unions. Many myths about the gods' numerous offspring, particularly Zeus's, serve to explain the origins of heroes, kings, and even entire lineages. These unions, however bizarre their circumstances, were seen as the source of powerful new beings and the continuation of the cosmic order. You'd trace the lineage of a great hero back to a divine father, perhaps a Zeus who disguised himself as an ant or a cloud, and a mortal mother, linking humanity directly to the divine through these often unconventional unions. One mainstream historical fact that showcases the public acceptance of these myths is their ubiquitous presence in epic poetry, drama, and visual arts. From Homer's epics to the tragedies of Aeschylus, from grand temple sculptures to everyday vase paintings, the sexual exploits of the gods were constantly retold and depicted. These were not fringe stories, they were central to Greek cultural identity. You wouldn't be able to escape them. They were literally all around you, shaping your understanding of the divine and the nature of desire. Now for another quirky or fringe tidbit. Some very old myths, particularly those from before the classical period, hint at even more primal and bizarre sexual unions among the earliest gods, involving primordial forces or elements. Think of the Titans, whose generation involved more chaotic and monstrous couplings, such as Uranos, sky, and Gaia, earth, giving birth to mountains and monstrous cyclopes. These older myths are even more unsettling in their frankness and lack of human moral restraint, a testament to a wilder, more untamed divine past. Imagine Cronus, devouring his own children to prevent them from overthrowing him, a gruesome act rooted in a primordial fear of generational replacement, a kind of cosmic cannibalism intertwined with the very act of procreation. The scholarly debate about the representation of divine non-consensual acts, often termed rape in modern scholarship, is particularly sensitive. Historians still argue whether ancient Greeks perceived these divine actions as rape, in the same moral sense that modern audiences do, or if they were understood primarily as demonstrations of overwhelming divine power and prerogative, a force beyond human judgment. Was it seen as a violation, or simply as the irresistible will of a god? This nuanced discussion helps us avoid anachronistically applying modern ethics to ancient contexts. You must remember that the very definition of consent was different in ancient Greece, especially when dealing with hierarchical power dynamics. A god's will was often absolute, and a mortal's resistance was frequently futile. This power imbalance was reflected in the myths, where the god's desires often trumped mortal agency. You wouldn't find a divine "Do You Me Too" movement. Rather, you'd find mortals trying to either appease or cunningly evade the god's unpredictable desires. Consider the role of minor deities and spirits in sexual folklore. Satyrs, lustful half-human, half-goat creatures associated with Dionysus, were infamous for their relentless pursuit of nymphs and mortal women, often depicted in explicit and humorous sexual encounters. Pans, with their goat legs and mischievous pipes, were also known for their amorous pursuits. These figures embodied the wild, untamed aspects of sexuality, operating outside the stricter social norms applied to humans. You'd hear tales of a beautiful nymph escaping a pursuing satyr, or a terrified shepherdess encountering a horny Pan in the woods, adding a playful, sometimes frightening layer to the divine sexual landscape. The myths of divine punishment for sexual transgressions, even those initiated by a god, also reveal a complex moral code. While Zeus might face no repercussions for his philandering, a mortal who boasted of sleeping with a god, or a goddess who scorned a powerful lover, might face severe divine wrath. This highlights the double standards inherent in the divine hierarchy, where power dictated morality. You'd learn through these myths that while gods could act with impunity, mortals played a dangerous game when interacting with divine passion. Even the concept of divine beauty was often intertwined with sexual desirability. Aphrodite's allure was inherent to her divinity. Hera's beauty was a source of her power over Zeus. The gods were not only powerful, but also physically perfect, designed to inspire awe and, often, desire. You'd see statues of Aphrodite so beautiful they were said to move men to tears, their form embodying an irresistible sexual potency that was both sacred and profoundly human. The creation myths themselves often involved bizarre sexual unions. The primordial gods, like Uranus, Sky, and Gaia, Earth, engaged in fertile couplings that gave birth to the cosmos and all its inhabitants. These foundational acts were seen as inherently sexual, setting the precedent for all life. You wouldn't have a creation story without a primal sexual act at its core, a testament to how deeply interwoven sexuality was with their understanding of existence itself. As you conclude your journey through the bizarre sexual unions of the gods, leaving behind the tempestuous Olympian dramas and the chaotic antics of satyrs, you're left with a profound appreciation for how ancient Greek mythology served as a powerful lens through which to understand human desire, power, and the complex interplay between the sacred and the profane. Their gods, far from being pristine moralizers, were reflections of humanity's deepest passions and wildest impulses, reminding us that the divine, for the Greeks, was just as carnal, and often just as bizarre as the human. From the dizzying heights of Olympus and the divine sexual escapades, you now descend into the very human realm of same-sex relationships, specifically focusing on how homosexuality was viewed and practiced in different Greek city-states. Forget any monolithic understanding. Ancient Greece presented a fascinating and often contradictory spectrum of acceptance, integration, and sometimes subtle disapproval. Imagine stepping into the rigorous training grounds of Sparta, where young men hone their bodies and minds, or the intellectual salons of Athens, where philosophical discussions often intertwined with intimate male bonds. You're about to discover how these relationships, particularly between men, were deeply woven into the social, military, and educational fabric of various Greek societies, often in ways that defy modern categorization. The mainstream historical fact here is that same-gender bonds were not only tolerated but actively institutionalized in some Greek city-states, most notably in Sparta and parts of Crete, often for military and pedagogical purposes. These relationships, often mentorship-based in nature between an older man and an adolescent boy, were seen as fostering loyalty, courage, and a shared sense of excellence. You'd find Spartan hoplites fighting side by side with their chosen companions, believing that the strength of their connection would make them fight more fiercely and avoid shame in battle. This wasn't merely a private preference, it was a societal tool for cohesion and military prowess. Now for a quirky tidbit that highlights the ritualization of these bonds. In some Dorian societies, particularly in Crete, the gifting of an ox by the mentor to the youth marked a formal initiation into manhood and the conclusion of the close personal aspect of their relationship. Imagine a young man, having spent a period of intense mentorship and physical intimacy with his older companion, receiving a fully grown ox as a public sign of his transition to adult status. It's a rather substantial graduation gift, isn't it? And certainly a memorable way to mark the end of one phase of intimacy and the beginning of another. The scholarly debate surrounding Greek homosexuality often centres on the precise nature of these relationships. Were they primarily sexual with a veneer of pedagogy, or truly pedagogical with an accepted sexual component? Historians still argue whether the physical aspect was seen as essential for the formation of character and virtue, or if it was simply a natural byproduct of intense male bonding in a society that valued male beauty. Were these relationships truly egalitarian, or did they always maintain a strict power dynamic based on age? You can almost hear the academic arguments. Was it eros as a pathway to arete, or arete as a justification for eros? You must understand that the ancient Greeks did not conceptualize sexual identity in terms of homosexuality or heterosexuality as fixed orientations. Instead, they focused on the active-passive roles in sexual acts and the social status of the participants. For a free man to take the active role with another male, especially a younger one, a slave or a pornose, was generally acceptable and masculine. For a free adult man to take the passive role was often seen as shameful or effeminate. This distinction is crucial for understanding the social acceptance of certain same-sex relationships. You wouldn't ask someone if they were gay. You might ask if they preferred boys, or if they acted like a woman in bed. Consider the Sacred Band of Thebes, a famous military unit composed entirely of 150 pairs of male lovers. This elite force, renowned for its bravery and effectiveness, was built on the premise that men would fight more valiantly to protect their beloveds and avoid shame in their eyes. This was not a secret. It was a celebrated aspect of their military strategy. You'd imagine these pairs, bound by both love and martial duty, standing unyielding in battle, their courage fueled by their intimate connection. It's a powerful testament to the belief that love could be a potent military asset. The philosophical discussions around male-on-male love, particularly in Athens, also shaped its perception. Plato's Symposium famously explores different forms of eros, presenting a hierarchy where love for a beautiful boy could elevate the lover to a pursuit of ultimate truth and beauty. This intellectualized form of pederasty aimed to transcend mere physical desire, using it as a stepping stone to philosophical enlightenment. You'd find philosophers arguing about the purest form of eros, suggesting that the love between men, when directed towards virtue and wisdom, was superior to the love for women, which was seen as solely for procreation. One mainstream historical fact that demonstrates the legal tolerance of male-on-male relationships in Athens is that while there were laws against male prostitution, selling one's body for sex, especially for payment if you were a citizen, there were no laws against consensual sexual acts between free adult men or between an Erastes and an Eromenos within the pederastic framework. This legal silence, rather than explicit endorsement, implied a de facto acceptance, provided it adhered to societal norms regarding age, status, and active-passive roles. You wouldn't find Athenians legislating against private intimacies between free men, as long as public decorum was maintained and no citizens were dishonoured. Now, for another quirky or fringe tidbit. In some ancient Greek comedies, older, effeminate men who enjoyed being the passive partner in sexual encounters were often ridiculed. This wasn't about their sexual preference per se, but about their perceived departure from masculine norms. Imagine a comedic play where an older character, clearly enjoying being submissive, is the butt of jokes, highlighting the societal expectation for free men to maintain an active, dominant sexual role, even in same-sex relations. It's a glimpse into the complex interplay of sexuality, gender roles, and humour. The scholarly debate concerning female same-sex relationships in ancient Greece is particularly challenging due to the scarcity of sources. Historians still argue whether the poetry of Sappho, which speaks of passionate love between women on Lesbos, reflects widespread practices or a unique, isolated phenomenon. Was there a thriving culture of female homosexuality, or was it largely confined to specific artistic or aristocratic circles, mostly hidden from the male-dominated historical record? The silence of the male authors on this topic leaves much to speculation and careful interpretation. You must remember that while male same-sex relationships were often formalized and publicly acknowledged, even if the sexual aspect was implicitly understood, female same-sex relationships were far less visible. Women's lives were largely confined to the domestic sphere, and male authors, who produced most of the surviving texts, rarely delved into the intimate lives of women outside of marriage and procreation. This makes it difficult to ascertain the prevalence or social acceptance of such relationships, though Sappho's poetry certainly suggests their existence and intensity. You'd imagine women in private spaces, perhaps in women-only gatherings, sharing intimate bonds and emotional connections that were simply not recorded in the public discourse. Consider the sexual liberty of male citizens compared to women. A man could engage in sexual relations with various partners, his wife, heterai, pornai, male or female, and younger male companions, without social stigma, as long as he maintained his active role and avoided dishonourable behaviour. This broad spectrum of acceptable partners highlights a different cultural understanding of male sexuality, one that was far more expansive than later Western norms. You'd find a man freely moving between different types of sexual relationships, experiencing a level of sexual freedom that would be unthinkable for a respectable woman of the time. The concept of beauty in ancient Greece, especially the appreciation of the male form, played a significant role in fostering same-sex desires. The naked gymnasia, athletic competitions, and idealized sculpture all contributed to an environment where male beauty was openly celebrated and admired, naturally leading to attraction between men. Remember the discussion about the naked games? The visual stimulus was constant, reinforcing the aesthetic appeal of the male body. The military context, as seen with the sacred band of Thebes, provides a powerful example of how same-sex love was integrated into society for pragmatic reasons. It wasn't just about personal pleasure, it was about building stronger, more courageous fighting units. This instrumentalization of love for military ends is a testament to the Greek willingness to use any means necessary to achieve excellence and victory. You'd be a young recruit, knowing that your bond with an older comrade could literally save your life in battle, forging an unbreakable loyalty. Even in literature and poetry, the love between men was often celebrated with an intensity and lyrical beauty that sometimes surpassed descriptions of heterosexual love. The emotional and intellectual depth of these relationships was a recurring theme, suggesting that they were not merely physical but profoundly affective. You'd read poems expressing longing, devotion, and even heartbreak between male lovers, revealing the full spectrum of human emotion. As you step away from the diverse and complex landscape of same-sex relationships in ancient Greece, leaving behind the Spartan barracks and the Athenian symposia, you are left with a powerful understanding of a culture that embraced different forms of intimacy with a pragmatism and openness that challenges modern assumptions. It reminds us that sexuality is a social construct, shaped by unique historical, cultural, and philosophical forces, and that what might seem bizarre to one era was simply a natural, often celebrated aspect of life in another. From the martial bonds of Sparta and the intellectual intimacy of Athenian male relationships, you now turn to a realm where the strange and the sacred converged in a chillingly intimate way. The role of oracles and prophecy, and how their pronouncements sometimes intertwined with sexual acts or interpretations. Forget the simple image of a wise old woman dispensing cryptic advice. The oracular tradition in ancient Greece could be a deeply unsettling, sometimes sexually charged experience where divine revelation touched the human body in unexpected ways. Imagine approaching the hallowed precincts of Delphi, the scent of laurel leaves and incense heavy in the air, a hushed reverence punctuated by the uneasy whispers of petitioners. You're about to discover how the pursuit of divine knowledge could lead to encounters that blurred the lines between spiritual communion and intimate contact. The mainstream historical fact here is that oracles, most famously the Pythia at Delphi, delivered prophecies that were believed to be the direct words of a god, often spoken in an altered state of consciousness, and these pronouncements held immense sway over personal lives and state affairs. People travelled from across the Greek world to seek divine guidance on everything from military campaigns and founding colonies to personal decisions like marriage or health. You'd find a nervous petitioner, perhaps a general before a major battle or a farmer worried about his crops, waiting anxiously for the Pythia's often ambiguous words, which would then be interpreted by priests. This divine guidance was not simply philosophical, it was meant to be actionable and literally life-changing. Now for a quirky tidbit that might make you think about the Pythia's inspiration. Some ancient sources suggest that the Pythia might have inhaled intoxicating fumes, perhaps from geological vents or burning hallucinogenic herbs like laurel leaves, that induced her trance-like state. Imagine a high priestess, seated on a tripod over a chasm, breathing in vapours that transported her beyond the mundane, leading her to utter divine pronouncements in a frenzy. While modern scholarship often debunks the idea of strong hallucinogenic gases at Delphi, the ancient perception certainly lent a bizarre, almost primal element to the prophetic experience. The scholarly debate surrounding the Pythia's trance and the nature of her pronouncements often questions the extent to which genuine geological phenomena, psychological factors, or ritualistic practices contributed to her altered state. Historians still argue whether the Pythia was truly experiencing divine possession, or if her trances were induced by more mundane means, and how much the priests consciously shaped her ambiguous utterances into coherent prophecies. Was it divine inspiration or calculated performance? You can almost hear the scientific and historical debates raging, trying to demystify the sacred. You must understand that for the ancient Greeks, the divine was not distant or abstract. It was immanent and could directly communicate with mortals, often through intermediaries like oracles. This communication, however, was rarely straightforward. The gods were powerful and often capricious, and their messages could be obscure, requiring careful interpretation. The oracular experience was meant to be profound and awe-inspiring, a direct conduit to the divine will, however unsettling that might be. Consider the role of temple attendants and priestesses. While the Pythia at Delphi was the most famous, many other smaller oracles and cults also had priestesses or male priests who served as conduits for divine messages. In some fertility cults, or those dedicated to chthonic underworld deities, the act of divine communication might have involved symbolic, or even literal sexual encounters. These acts were not for personal gratification, but were believed to facilitate a deeper connection with the deity, allowing the divine message to flow more directly through the human vessel. You'd find a petitioner approaching a priestess, not just for words, but for a ritualistic interaction that might involve touch or symbolic union, believing it would unlock divine secrets. The concept of sacred marriage, hieros gamos, which we touched upon earlier, also extends to some oracular contexts. In some cults, a priestess might symbolically marry or have sexual union with the god she served, becoming a vessel for his divine power and prophetic insight. This could involve an actual ritualistic sexual act, or a deeply symbolic one, where the priestess embodied the divine female counterpart to the male deity. You can imagine a solemn ceremony where a priestess, embodying the goddess, engages in a ritual union with a symbolic representation of the god, believing this act would imbue her with prophetic visions. One mainstream historical fact that hints at the intimate nature of some oracular practices is the consultation of dream oracles. In cults dedicated to healing gods like Asclepius, petitioners would sleep within the temple precincts, a practice called incubation, hoping to receive a divine dream that would reveal a cure for their ailments. While not explicitly sexual, these dreams could sometimes contain erotic elements, or involve the god appearing in a sexually suggestive manner, leading to interpretations that blurred the lines between healing and intimate revelation. You'd find a sick person sleeping in a temple, hoping for a dream where Asclepius might appear and touch them in a way that would bring healing, perhaps even a sexually charged dream interpreted as divine favour. Now for another quirky or fringe tidbit. Some ancient Greek magical papyri, which contain spells and rituals, include instructions for inducing erotic dreams, or for compelling someone to fall in love, sometimes by invoking specific deities or spirits and performing rituals that mimic sexual acts. While these are not formal oracular practices, they demonstrate a popular belief in the power of ritual and the divine to influence sexual outcomes, often through bizarre and intimate means. Imagine a lovelorn individual secretly performing a ritual, perhaps involving a miniature doll and whispered incantations, hoping to manipulate the gods into bringing their beloved into their arms, a kind of ancient love spell with magical underpinnings. The scholarly debate about the extent of literal sexual practices in oracular contexts is particularly difficult, due to the secretive nature of many mystery cults and the ambiguity of ancient texts. Historians still argue whether descriptions of communion with the god, or entering the god's embrace, were always purely metaphorical, or if they sometimes implied actual sexual contact as a means to achieve prophetic states or divine blessings. The line between metaphor and reality is often blurred, making definitive conclusions challenging. You must understand that the ancient Greeks had a holistic view of the body and spirit. The physical body was not seen as separate from the spiritual realm. It could be a conduit for divine energy, emotion, and revelation. Therefore, intimate or even sexual acts, when performed in a ritualistic context, could be considered sacred and a legitimate means of communion with the divine. You wouldn't find them separating the spiritual from the carnal in the way that some later religions would. For them, the two were often inextricably linked. Consider the role of temple prostitutes, hierodulai, again, particularly those associated with Aphrodite's cults, but also potentially in other temples. While their primary function was often to provide revenue for the temple, their sexual acts with petitioners could also be interpreted as a form of sacred devotion, bringing the worshipper into a direct, if temporary, relationship with the deity's power of love and fertility, potentially granting blessings or insights. Remember the Corinthian Aphrodite. Her priestesses were conduits for a divine form of intimacy, that blurred the lines between worship and sexual encounter. The fear and awe surrounding oracles were immense. The uncertainty of the future, the power of the gods, and the unpredictable nature of prophecy all contributed to an atmosphere where people were willing to undergo unusual experiences to gain divine favour or knowledge. This willingness to engage in potentially bizarre rituals highlights the profound human need for certainty in an uncertain world, even if it meant venturing into intimate, perhaps unsettling territory. You'd be desperate for an answer, willing to try almost anything to receive it, even if it meant engaging in a strange ritualistic act. Even beyond formal oracles, the concept of divine possession could lead to uninhibited, sometimes sexually expressive behaviour. The Maenads, followers of Dionysus, in their ecstatic frenzies, would often abandon social norms, engaging in wild dances and behaviours that blurred the lines between spiritual ecstasy and sexual abandon. While not strictly oracular, their altered states demonstrate how divine influence could lead to profound and often sexually charged transformations of behaviour. You'd witness someone in a Dionysiac trance, their movements uninhibited, their eyes glazed over, seemingly lost to the world, a direct conduit for the god's untamed energy. The ambiguity of oracular pronouncements sometimes led to humorous or ironic situations regarding sexual matters. A prophecy might advise someone to know themselves in a way that could be interpreted both intellectually and sexually, or to embrace the fertile earth, which could be taken literally or metaphorically. This ambiguity often allowed for a wide range of interpretations, sometimes leading to bizarre personal actions based on a misunderstanding or a deliberate misinterpretation of the divine will. You'd hear a story of someone who took an oracle's advice too literally, leading to a comedic or scandalous sexual outcome, a kind of divine prank. As you step away from the hushed and sometimes unsettling precincts of ancient Greek oracles, leaving behind the smoky air and the whispered prophecies, you're left with a powerful understanding of how intertwined the spiritual and the sexual were in their quest for divine knowledge. The bizarre practices surrounding prophecy, from trance-inducing fumes to ritualistic unions, reveal a culture that saw the human body and its intimate acts as legitimate conduits for divine communication, a testament to their holistic view of existence, where even the most sacred moments could possess a startlingly carnal dimension. From the cryptic pronouncements of oracles and the often intimate paths to divine revelation, you now delve into the rigid, yet occasionally paradoxical world of ancient Greek gender roles and expectations, particularly how they shaped and constrained sexual freedoms. Forget any notion of gender equality. This was a society meticulously stratified by sex, where men and women occupied vastly different spheres, leading to strikingly divergent experiences of intimacy and desire. Imagine walking through an ancient Athenian household. In one part, men freely engage in intellectual discourse and sexual pursuits. In another, women are cloistered, their lives circumscribed by domestic duties and the constant pressure to maintain their honour. You're about to see how these entrenched roles dictated not just public behaviour, but also the very landscape of bizarre or unconventional sexual practices. The mainstream historical fact here is that ancient Greek society, especially in classical Athens, was profoundly patriarchal, with strict gender roles that afforded free men significantly more freedom and agency, particularly in their sexual lives, than respectable citizen women. Men were expected to participate in public life, including politics, philosophy, and military service, and their sexual activities, provided they maintained the dominant role and did not violate the honour of other male citizens' households, were largely unscrutinised. You'd find a man openly engaging with hetairai, visiting pornai, or pursuing pederastic relationships, all while his wife remained confined to the home, her chastity paramount. This stark asymmetry was a foundational element of their social structure. Now, for a quirky tidbit that highlights the extremes of female confinement, in some very traditional or conservative households, a wife might be so secluded that she rarely, if ever, saw her husband's male friends or engaged in conversation with any men outside her immediate family. Imagine a woman living in her own home, barely knowing the faces of her husband's closest companions, her world limited to female relatives, servants, and her children. It paints a picture of isolation that is truly alien to modern concepts of social interaction and family life. The scholarly debate surrounding female agency in ancient Greece often questions the extent to which women, despite their legal and social limitations, found ways to exert influence or express their desires. Historians still argue whether the apparent passivity of respectable women was a genuine reflection of their inner lives, or if they found subtle forms of resistance, negotiation, or private expression that are simply not well documented in male-authored sources. Was their world truly as limited as it appears, or did they have a rich, hidden life that defies our current understanding? You can almost hear the feminist historians meticulously dissecting every archaeological find and fragmented text for clues to women's unwritten stories. You must understand that a woman's honour, particularly that of a citizen wife or daughter, was inextricably linked to her sexual purity and modesty. Any perceived transgression could bring shame not only upon herself but upon her entire family. This intense focus on female chastity was a primary driver of their confinement and the strict rules governing their behaviour. You'd find a father or husband constantly vigilant about his female relative's reputation, knowing that a single rumour could jeopardise their social standing and marriage prospects. Consider the concept of reproduction as duty for women. While men had broad sexual freedoms, a respectable woman's sexuality was primarily for procreation, to produce legitimate heirs for her husband's oikos, household. Her value was largely tied to her fertility, and her ability to manage the household efficiently. You'd imagine a young wife facing immense pressure to conceive quickly and deliver healthy sons, her intimate life reduced, in public discourse, to its reproductive function. One mainstream historical fact that illustrates the severe consequences for female sexual transgression is the draconian laws against adultery. If a man caught another man in moichia, adultery with his wife, daughter, sister or mother, he had the right to kill the adulterer on the spot, or at least to inflict severe physical punishment. This brutal legal allowance highlights the extreme emphasis on male control over female sexuality and the protection of legitimate lineage. You wouldn't find a woman having an affair lightly. The stakes were literally life and death for her lover, and severe public disgrace for herself. Now, for another quirky or fringe tidbit, some ancient Greek medical texts, like those attributed to Hippocrates, contained advice for women on how to induce menstruation or conception, sometimes involving bizarre concoctions or ritualistic bathing. While not inherently sexual acts, these practices reveal the intense focus on female reproductive health and the sometimes strange, intimate remedies used to control female bodies. Imagine a woman consuming a strange herbal mixture or sitting over a steaming concoction, all to influence her bodily functions in accordance with societal expectations. It highlights a fascinating, if sometimes misguided, intersection of medicine and intimate ritual. The scholarly debate about the experience of female sexual desire in ancient Greece is particularly challenging. Historians still argue whether women, given their restricted lives and the strong emphasis on procreation, were generally expected to suppress or simply not possess strong sexual desires, or if such desires were acknowledged privately, but simply not expressed openly. Did they truly lack desire, or were they just taught to hide it effectively? The silence in male-authored texts on this subject leaves a significant void in our understanding. You must remember that while respectable women were largely confined, other categories of women, like heterai and pornai, common prostitutes, often slaves or foreigners, existed outside these strictures and had very different sexual realities. Heterai, as we discussed, enjoyed intellectual freedom and a form of social agency, even as their sexual services were part of their profession. Pornai had virtually no rights or social standing, their bodies exploited with impunity. This class-based and status-based distinction profoundly shaped access to, or lack thereof, sexual freedom and its bizarre manifestations. You'd see a free woman's life rigorously controlled, while an enslaved woman's body was considered property, subject to her owner's will, a stark and unsettling contrast. Consider the role of homosocial environments for men. The symposium, the gymnasium, and military training all fostered intense male bonding, often with an accepted erotic component, pederasty. These spaces allowed men to express their desires and form intimate relationships outside the confines of the patriarchal family structure. This meant that while respectable female sexuality was tightly controlled, male sexuality had multiple outlets and forms of expression, often encouraged by the very institutions that defined male civic life. You'd find men building deep emotional and physical bonds with other men, a parallel intimate world to the one they shared with their wives. The limited social interactions for women meant that their opportunities for bizarre or unconventional sexual practices were largely confined to the private sphere, and even there, likely limited by the constant presence of servants, children, and other family members. Any such practices would have been kept strictly secret, as their discovery could lead to immediate dishonour and potential severe repercussions. You'd imagine any deviation from the norm occurring only in the deepest privacy, perhaps involving objects or fantasies rather than external partners. One mainstream historical fact that further emphasises female restriction is the concept of the kyrios, male guardian. Every respectable Athenian woman, from birth until death, was under the legal guardianship of a male, her father, husband, or closest male relative. She could not conduct legal transactions, own significant property, apart from her dowry, which was managed by her kyrios, or initiate legal proceedings without his consent. This legal subjugation inherently limited her personal and sexual autonomy. You'd find a woman's entire life dictated by the decisions of the men around her, leaving little room for independent sexual expression. Now, for another quirky or fringe tidbit, in some ancient Greek homes there might have been a women's festival, or private rituals performed exclusively by women, possibly involving symbolic acts related to fertility or female mysteries. While not overtly sexual in the way male rituals could be, these could have involved female bonding and discussions of intimate female experiences that were kept secret from men. Imagine a gathering of women sharing ancient knowledge about contraception or childbirth, perhaps performing small intimate rituals that affirmed their female power away from the male gaze. The scholarly debate about the private life of Greek women is a persistent challenge. Historians still argue whether the apparent lack of explicit erotic art depicting respectable women engaging in sexual acts, as opposed to hetairai, is due to their actual restriction from such practices, or simply a reflection of the male artistic gaze and the desire to portray ideal female modesty. Did they not engage in diverse sexual practices, or did male artists simply not depict them? You must remember that the Greeks did not necessarily view these gender roles as unfair in the modern sense. They were seen as natural, divinely ordained, and essential for the harmonious functioning of society. Each gender had its designated sphere and responsibilities, and deviation was seen as disruptive to the polis. This mindset profoundly shaped expectations around sexual behaviour, making what we call bizarre often simply a matter of adhering to, or subtly circumventing prescribed norms. Even within the context of marriage, a woman's sexual experience was often dictated by her husband's desires. Her role was generally passive, and her pleasure was rarely the focus of ancient texts. Any specific sexual practices within the marriage would have been at the husband's discretion, and the wife was expected to comply. You'd imagine a wife submitting to her husband's desires, even if they were unusual, as part of her wifely duty, with little room for personal preference. As you conclude your exploration of ancient Greek gender roles and expectations, leaving behind the tightly controlled lives of women and the expansive freedoms of men, you are left with a powerful understanding of how profoundly social structure shaped intimate lives. The bizarre practices, whether celebrated or concealed, often emerged from these stark inequalities, revealing a society where sexual expression was deeply intertwined with power, status, and the rigid confines of gender. It reminds us that freedom, even intimate freedom, has always been a privilege, not a universal right. From the rigid confines of gender roles, you now move into a fascinating, often unsettling intersection of ancient Greek sexuality and their evolving understanding of the human body, medical beliefs concerning humours and health. Forget sterile operating theatres and scientific precision. This was a world where illness and well-being were profoundly linked to the balance of bodily fluids, astrological influences, and, remarkably, sexual activity. Imagine consulting an ancient Greek physician, not for a quick prescription, but for an intricate diagnosis based on your complexion, your temperament, and perhaps your recent intimate history. You're about to discover how the most bizarre sexual practices could be prescribed as remedies, or conversely, how certain sexual acts were believed to cause illness, all within the framework of their humoral theory. The mainstream historical fact here is that ancient Greek medicine, heavily influenced by Hippocrates, was based on the theory of the four humours blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Health was believed to be a state of balance among these humours, and illness resulted from an excess or deficiency of one or more. Treatments often involve diet, exercise, purges, bloodletting, and significantly for our topic, recommendations regarding sexual activity to restore this crucial balance. You'd find a physician meticulously observing a patient's bodily fluids, their fever or their mood, trying to determine which humour was out of whack, and then prescribing a regimen that might include specific sexual practices. Now for a quirky tidbit that might make you question your ancient Greek doctor's bedside manner. Some medical texts advised men who were suffering from certain ailments, especially those related to anxiety or melancholy, associated with an excess of black bile, to engage in regular sexual intercourse as a therapeutic measure. Imagine a Greek husband being told by his doctor, "My dear man, your temperament is too dry and cold. I prescribe frequent conjugal relations to warm your humours and restore balance." It positions sexual activity not just as pleasure or procreation, but as a vital component of medical treatment, a kind of ancient sex therapy with a humoral twist. The scholarly debate surrounding these medical sexual prescriptions often questions the empirical basis for such advice and the extent to which it was truly effective. Historians still argue whether these recommendations were based on actual observed physiological effects, or if they were largely theoretical deductions from humoral theory, intertwined with existing social norms about male and female bodies. Did these bizarre prescriptions actually work, or was it a placebo effect coupled with societal expectations? You can almost hear the ancient physicians debating the precise dosage of intimacy required for optimal health. You must understand that the ancient Greeks viewed the body as an open system, constantly interacting with its environment and subject to various inflows and outflows. Sexual fluids, particularly male semen, were considered potent substances, and their retention or release was believed to have profound effects on overall health. This perspective led to unique medical theories concerning sexual activity. You'd find elaborate discussions in medical texts about the quality of semen, the temperature of the uterus, and the ideal frequency of intercourse for both men and women. Consider the concept of wandering womb, or hysteria, in women. This was a pervasive medical theory that attributed various female ailments, from anxiety and melancholy to convulsions and suffocation, to a wandering or suffocated uterus, which was believed to move freely within the body, seeking moisture. The prescribed remedies often included sexual intercourse or pregnancy, as these were believed to anchor the womb and provide it with necessary fluids. You'd find a woman suffering from what we now recognise as anxiety, being told that regular sexual activity was her only cure, a bizarre and rather intrusive medical intervention by modern standards. One mainstream historical fact that highlights the detailed, though often erroneous, physiological theories is the belief that female orgasm was necessary for conception. While modern science shows this is not the case, ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates and later Galen believed that both male and female seed, fluid, were required for successful procreation, and that the woman's contribution was released during orgasm. This belief placed a unique emphasis on female pleasure, not just for its own sake, but as a physiological necessity for reproduction. You'd imagine couples being advised to ensure mutual pleasure to maximise their chances of conception, making the intimate act more about coordinated physiological release than simple male penetration. Now, for another quirky or fringe tidbit. Some ancient Greek medical texts contained detailed instructions for preparing pessaries, vaginal suppositories, made from bizarre ingredients like crocodile dung, honey, or even specific animal fats, intended for contraception, inducing menstruation, or promoting fertility. While not directly sexual acts, the intimate application of such strange concoctions, sometimes accompanied by incantations, reveals a pragmatic and often bizarre approach to reproductive health. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from another section? It seems the Nile's faunal contributions were quite versatile in ancient remedies. The scholarly debate about the extent of women's sexual pleasure in ancient Greece is a complex one. Historians still argue whether the belief in the necessity of female orgasm for conception led to a more considerate approach to female sexual pleasure within marriage, or if it was simply a physiological theory that did not necessarily translate into a focus on women's enjoyment. Was this medical theory a liberating factor for women's pleasure, or just another way to instrumentalize their bodies for procreation? You must understand that these medical beliefs influenced not just curative practices, but also preventative ones. Certain sexual practices might be encouraged or discouraged based on a person's perceived humoral balance, or their stage of life. For instance, too much sexual activity for an older man might be seen as depleting his vital seed and weakening him, while for a younger, more sanguine individual, it might be viewed as a healthy release of excess heat. You'd find different sexual advice tailored to your age, temperament, and constitution, all to maintain humoral equilibrium. Consider the role of diet and exercise in conjunction with sexual recommendations. A physician might not just prescribe sexual intercourse, but also specific foods to eat, e.g., heating or cooling foods, or exercises to perform, all aimed at rebalancing the humours. This holistic approach meant that sexual activity was rarely seen in isolation, but as part of a broader lifestyle regimen. You'd be told to eat more fish, run more laps, and perhaps engage in intercourse X number of times a week, a comprehensive lifestyle prescription for optimal health. The fear of depletion through excessive sexual activity, particularly for men, was a common theme in ancient medical texts. It was believed that the loss of semen could lead to weakness, illness, or even death. This belief sometimes led to ascetic practices or periods of abstinence, particularly for athletes or philosophers who sought to conserve their vital energy. You'd find a wrestler abstaining from sex before a major competition, believing it would conserve his strength and focus, a kind of ancient no-fap philosophy for peak performance. One mainstream historical fact that illustrates the practical application of these theories is the emphasis on the timing and moderation of sexual intercourse. Physicians often advised against intercourse immediately after heavy meals, during periods of extreme heat or cold, or when one was fatigued, believing that such timing could disrupt the body's natural balance and lead to illness. You'd be given specific instructions on when not to engage in sexual activity, not for moral reasons, but for health reasons, a very pragmatic approach to intimate timing. Now for another quirky or fringe tidbit. Some very rare ancient medical spells or charms explicitly invoked deities like Aphrodite or Eros to aid in conception or to resolve sexual dysfunction. While not strictly medical in the modern sense, these magical interventions reveal a belief that intimate bodily functions could be influenced by divine powers, often through bizarre incantations or ritualistic gestures. Imagine someone whispering a strange charm over a struggling couple, invoking Aphrodite's aid to open the pathways of fertility, blurring the lines between medicine, magic, and sexuality. The scholarly debate about the actual effectiveness of these medical sexual interventions is often dismissive from a modern scientific standpoint, but it highlights the profound impact of belief systems on health. Historians still argue whether the perceived benefits were due to a placebo effect, the psychosomatic impact of receiving medical attention, or simply the body's natural healing processes occurring independently of the prescribed remedies. Did these bizarre prescriptions actually make people feel better, regardless of their scientific validity? You must remember that for the ancient Greeks, medicine was not just a science, but also an art, deeply intertwined with philosophy, religion, and everyday life. The body was a microcosm of the cosmos, and its balance was crucial for harmony. Sexual activity, therefore, was not just a personal act, but a force with cosmological implications, capable of creating both health and disease. You wouldn't separate your sexual life from your physical well-being. They were two sides of the same ancient coin. Even specific dietary recommendations for sexual health were common. Certain foods were believed to be aphrodisiacs or to enhance fertility, while others were thought to diminish desire or potency. You'd be advised to consume specific herbs, certain animal organs, or particular types of wine to either stimulate or curb your sexual appetite, all part of a comprehensive approach to managing the body's humours. As you step away from the ancient Greek physician's study, leaving behind the discussions of wandering wombs and balanced humours, you're left with a powerful understanding of how medical beliefs profoundly shaped and sometimes dictated intimate practices. The bizarre sexual prescriptions and prescriptions reveal a culture that saw the body's desires and functions as integral to its overall health, a fascinating blend of scientific observation, philosophical theory, and practical application that often blurred the lines between healing and intimate engagement. Having navigated the intriguing intersection of medical beliefs and sexual practices, you now venture into the deepest, most unsettling corners of ancient Greek society. The realm of forbidden desires, specifically incest and other profound taboos. Forget any notion of universal moral consensus. While some boundaries were clear, the The precise definitions of incest and what constituted the most egregious sexual transgressions were sometimes nuanced, even bizarre, shaped by myth, law, and social custom. Imagine yourself in a quiet Athenian courtroom, listening to hushed whispers and shocked gasps as a particularly scandalous case is presented, one that challenges the very fabric of family and community. You're about to confront the dark side of ancient Greek sexuality, where the limits of permissible desire were tested and the consequences could be devastating. The mainstream historical fact here is that incest, particularly between parents and children or full siblings, was generally a profound taboo in ancient Greek society, carrying severe social and religious penalties. Such unions were seen as a grave violation of the natural order and community norms, often leading to divine wrath and pollution, miasma. You'd find tragic plays, like Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, exploring the horrifying consequences of unwitting incest, demonstrating the deep-seated societal revulsion towards such relationships, even when committed unknowingly. This taboo was foundational to their understanding of legitimate family structures and social order. Now for a quirky tidbit that reveals a surprising exception to the rule. While full sibling incest was a strong taboo, marriage between half-siblings, particularly those sharing a father but not a mother, patrilateral half-siblings, was sometimes permitted, especially in Athens, to keep property within the family. Imagine a family meticulously calculating lineage to ensure that property rights were preserved, even if it meant a union that to modern eyes would seem uncomfortably close. This highlights a bizarre tension between the strictures of social taboo and the pragmatic demands of inheritance and wealth preservation. The scholarly debate surrounding the precise definition and enforcement of incest taboos is complex. Historians still argue whether the legal and social prohibitions against certain forms of incest were universally applied across all Greek city-states, or if there were regional variations and periods where exceptions or lesser taboos existed. Was the Athenian acceptance of patrilateral half-sibling marriage a unique quirk, or indicative of a broader flexibility in certain circumstances? You can almost hear the genealogists of old, meticulously drawing out family trees, trying to discern the acceptable boundaries of kinship. You must understand that the concept of miasma, or ritual pollution, played a significant role in enforcing taboos. Incestuous acts were believed to bring defilement upon not just the individuals involved, but also their family and the entire community, necessitating purification rituals to cleanse the land. You'd find a community suffering from plague or famine, believing it was the result of some hidden transgression, perhaps an incestuous union, requiring communal atonement and purification rituals to appease the angered gods. Consider the role of mythology in reflecting and reinforcing taboos. While the gods themselves engaged in numerous incestuous relationships, Zeus married his sister Hera, Cronus married his sister Rhea. These divine acts were often depicted as belonging to a primordial, chaotic era, or as expressions of immense, uncontrollable divine power, not as models for human emulation. You'd hear tales of the early gods, whose wild couplings created the cosmos, but these were presented as ancient, powerful forces, not as behaviours to be imitated by mortals, thereby creating a distinction between divine and human morality. The most severe taboos often revolved around violations of the oikos, household, and legitimate lineage. Sexual acts that blurred family lines, particularly those that threatened a man's certainty of his heirs, were considered extremely dangerous. This included not only incest but also adultery with a citizen wife, which was harshly punished as a violation of property and lineage. You'd find a husband seeking immediate and violent retribution for adultery, not just out of personal anger, but because it undermined the very foundation of his household and his legacy. One mainstream historical fact that illustrates a less commonly discussed taboo is the strong disapproval of male citizens acting as passive sexual partners with other free men, especially if they did so for money, male prostitution. While active male homosexuality within the pederastic framework was accepted, taking the passive role, particularly as an adult citizen, was often seen as effeminate and shameful, leading to a loss of civic rights, atimia. You'd find a man who had publicly engaged in passive prostitution being legally disenfranchised, unable to speak in the assembly or hold public office, highlighting a bizarre societal judgment based on sexual role rather than sexual object choice. Now for another quirky or fringe tidbit. In some ancient Greek philosophical or medical texts, there are oblique references to unnatural acts, paraphesin, which could include bestiality or extreme forms of sexual perversion. While rarely explicitly detailed, their very mention, often in hushed or condemnatory tones, suggests that such practices, however rare, existed in the fringe and were considered truly beyond the pale of societal acceptance. Imagine a philosopher discussing the limits of human depravity, perhaps referencing such unnatural acts as the ultimate degradation, even if he avoids explicit descriptions. The scholarly debate about these unnatural acts largely focuses on the scarcity of direct evidence. Historians still argue whether such references were purely rhetorical condemnations, meant to shock and define moral boundaries, or if they hinted at actual, albeit very rare and socially condemned fringe practices. How much do these brief mentions tell us about actual behaviour versus just the moral anxieties of the time? This ongoing discussion highlights the difficulty of inferring societal practice from negative condemnation. You must remember that taboos were not just legal or social prohibitions, they were deeply ingrained in the collective psyche, enforced through religious belief, public shame, and the threat of divine punishment. Breaking a major taboo could lead to ostracization, exile, or even death, particularly if the act was seen as polluting the community. You wouldn't simply get away with such transgressions. The social fabric itself would demand reckoning. Consider the notion of sexual relations with the dead, necrophilia, a profound taboo hinted at in some ancient sources. While extremely rare and universally condemned, its very existence as a concept suggests the extent of human sexual deviance that even ancient Greeks acknowledged as possible, however horrifying. The story of Herodotus' account of a king leaving his daughter's body to a man who could defile it suggests that such extreme acts, while abhorrent, were at least conceivable within the human imagination, making them a bizarre and truly dark corner of their sexual landscape. The distinction between consensual and non-consensual acts, particularly regarding slaves and pornai, also reveals a complex ethical landscape. While outright rape of a citizen woman was a grave crime, sexual access to enslaved individuals, male or female, was often considered a master's right and not a crime in the same legal sense. This created a profound power imbalance that allowed for bizarre and coercive sexual acts to occur within the bounds of legality, reflecting a deeply ingrained system of social hierarchy and dehumanization. You'd find a master engaging in intimate acts with his slave, acts that would be considered abhorrent if performed with a free person, yet entirely permissible under the law of the time. One mainstream historical fact that reveals a peculiar social taboo is the disapproval of men who consumed their own semen, or the semen of other men, believing it to be a wasteful or unnatural act. While not directly involving another person, this internal act was sometimes viewed as an act of self-pollution, or a violation of natural order, particularly in philosophical or medical discussions about the proper use of bodily fluids. You might hear a philosopher condemning such a practice as base or animalistic, a strange moral judgment on a private bodily function. Now, for another quirky or fringe tidbit, there are scattered references to cults or magical practices that involved the use of bodily fluids, including sexual fluids, for rituals aimed at cursing enemies or inducing love. While not widespread, these fringe magical practices sometimes incorporated bizarre and intimate elements, blurring the lines between sexual acts, folk magic, and profound transgression. Imagine someone attempting a dark ritual, perhaps using a drop of blood or semen to bind a lover or bring ruin upon an enemy, an intimate act twisted to a sinister purpose. The scholarly debate about the ancient Greek understanding of perversion is nuanced. Historians still argue whether the Greeks conceptualized sexual acts as perverted based on their nature, or primarily based on the social status, age or civic role of the participants, or whether such terms even existed in a modern sense. Was it the act itself that was taboo, or who performed it with whom, and in what context? This discussion helps us understand their moral framework, which often differed significantly from our own. You must remember that while we might categorize these acts as bizarre or forbidden, for the ancient Greeks, the definition of these terms was rooted in their unique social, religious, and legal systems. What was profoundly taboo in one context, e.g., incest with a full sibling, might have a surprising loophole in another, patrolateral half-sibling marriage for property. The boundaries were not always as clear-cut as we might assume, leading to a landscape of intimate life that was both rigid and, in its fringes, startlingly flexible. As you step away from the shadows of ancient Greek taboos, leaving behind the chilling tales of Oedipus and the harsh judgments of their laws, you are left with a powerful understanding of the fragile boundaries that societies construct around desire. The bizarre and forbidden acts, whether mythical or real, served as stark reminders of the social order, highlighting the lengths to which a culture would go to define, control, and sometimes, tragically, punish those who transgress the deepest intimate norms. It reminds us that even in societies often praised for their openness, profound and unsettling taboos always lurked beneath the surface. From the solemnity of taboos and the shadows of forbidden desires, you now emerge into a more boisterous and irreverent corner of ancient Greek society, the world of comedy and satire, where sexual humour was not just tolerated, but celebrated openly and vociferously. Forget any notion of polite euphemisms. Greek playwrights and poets delighted in crude jokes, exaggerated phallic costumes, and witty banter that gleefully mocked everything from personal foibles to the most intimate acts. Imagine yourself in the theatre of Dionysus in Athens, surrounded by thousands of boisterous citizens, roaring with laughter as actors in absurd costumes prance about, delivering lines that would make a modern audience gasp. You're about to discover how humour served as a release valve for societal tensions, a mirror for their sexual preoccupations, and a surprisingly public platform for addressing the bizarre aspects of intimate life. The mainstream historical fact here is that old comedy, exemplified by Aristophanes, was characterised by its outrageous costumes, bawdy humour, and overt sexual jokes, often featuring exaggerated phallic props and explicit references to sexual acts and body parts. These plays were performed during major religious festivals such as the Dionysia, highlighting how sexuality and humour were deeply intertwined with their public religious and civic life. You'd find actors wearing enormous floppy phalluses as part of their costumes, engaging in physical comedy that involved sexual gestures, and delivering lines that left no doubt about their risque intentions. This wasn't merely subtle innuendo, it was often blunt, unapologetic, and hilariously crude. Now for a quirky tidbit that might make you reconsider the origins of stand-up comedy. Some scholars suggest that the origins of Greek comedy lie partly in ancient fertility rituals, where ribald jokes and sexually explicit gestures were believed to encourage agricultural abundance and human fecundity. Imagine a group of early comedic performers, perhaps dressed in animal skins and sporting exaggerated phalluses, engaging in a raucous performance that mingled humour with a genuine belief in its ability to stimulate growth and prosperity. It bridges the gap between the sacred, the funny, and the downright bizarre, showing how deeply rooted sexual humour was in their cultural consciousness. The scholarly debate surrounding the function of comedic sexual humour often questions whether it was purely for entertainment, a form of social critique, or a cathartic release for societal tension surrounding sexuality. Historians still argue whether the exaggerated phallic props and explicit jokes were merely vulgar, or if they served a deeper purpose in confronting and normalising various sexual behaviours within the public sphere. Was it just cheap laughs, or did it subtly challenge or reinforce prevailing sexual norms? You can almost hear the ancient Athenians guffawing, perhaps unsure themselves of the deeper philosophical implications, but certainly enjoying the spectacle. You must understand that the ancient Greeks, unlike some later cultures, did not possess a strong sense of prudishness or shame regarding the body and its functions. Laughter was considered a legitimate human response to the absurdities of life, and sexuality in all its forms was a rich source of such absurdity. Comedy allowed them to poke fun at their own desires, anxieties, and social conventions surrounding intimate life, creating a safe space for communal release. You'd find audiences embracing the jokes with gusto, recognising themselves and their neighbours in the exaggerated caricatures on stage. Consider the role of satirical commentary. While often crude, Greek comedy wasn't just mindless entertainment. Playwrights like Aristophanes frequently used sexual humour to satirise politicians, philosophers, and contemporary social issues. A lewd joke about a prominent figure's supposed sexual appetite or impotence could be a powerful, if blunt, form of political critique. You'd find subtle, and not so subtle, digs at public figures embedded within the comedic sexual antics, showing how humour could be a sharp weapon in the public discourse. The use of exaggerated body parts and costumes was central to the comedic effect. Actors in old comedy wore padded costumes that made them appear rotund, and almost universally wore large artificial phalluses, often pointing upwards, symbolising their virility and adding to the visual absurdity. This wasn't about realism, it was about hyper-reality, pushing the boundaries of physical appearance for comedic impact. You'd see actors waddling across the stage, their enormous phalluses bouncing with every step, creating a visual gag that never failed to elicit laughter. One mainstream historical fact that highlights the public nature of this humour is that women were likely present in the audience for these plays, although their precise seating arrangements and numbers are debated. While their reactions might have been more subdued, they were exposed to the same raunchy humour and explicit visual gags as the men. You wouldn't find a separate, sanitised version of the play for women. They were part of the communal experience of laughter, even if the humour often targeted or objectified them. Now for another quirky or fringe tidbit. In some minor, less formal comedic performances or folk festivals, there might have been phallic songs, phallica, or improvisational performances that were even more overtly explicit and less constrained by a formal plot than the plays of Aristophanes. Imagine a spontaneous street performance, perhaps during a local harvest festival, where revellers engage in sing-alongs with highly suggestive lyrics, accompanied by crude gestures, a raw and uninhibited expression of popular sexual humour that would make even Aristophanes blush. The scholarly debate about the representation of female sexuality in Greek comedy is particularly complex. Historians still argue whether the portrayal of women as largely driven by sexual urges, e.g., at Lysistrata, where women withhold sex to end a war, was a genuine reflection of male anxieties about female desire, or simply a comedic trope used to advance the plot and provoke laughter. Did these portrayals genuinely reflect ancient Greek beliefs about female sexuality, or were they exaggerated for satirical effect? You must understand that Greek comedy provided a vital outlet for expressing anxieties and desires that might have been taboo in other contexts. By making fun of sexual acts, body parts, and social roles, they could diffuse tension, normalise unusual behaviours by bringing them into the light of laughter, and collectively acknowledge the messy, often contradictory, reality of human sexuality. You'd find people laughing at jokes about impotence, promiscuity, or bizarre fetishes, finding common ground in shared human experience, however unconventional. Consider the humour derived from cross-dressing or role reversal. While less overtly sexual, some comedies played with gender roles, sometimes involving men dressed as women or vice versa, creating humorous situations that subtly challenged or highlighted societal expectations about masculinity and femininity. This playful inversion could also touch upon sexual anxieties, exposing the fragility of gendered norms through comedic exaggeration. You'd see a male actor clumsily portraying a woman, exaggerating female mannerisms to great comedic effect, blurring the lines of gender identity for a laugh. The concept of verbal obscenity, ischrologia, was also a key element of comedic sexual humour. Playwrights used explicit language, vulgar puns, and direct references to genitalia and sexual acts with abandon. This wasn't considered profanity in the modern sense. It was a recognised comedic tool, part of the genre's frank and uninhibited style. You'd hear characters trading insults filled with anatomical descriptions, or engaging in wordplay that revolved around sexual double entendres, all to the delight of the audience. One mainstream historical fact that demonstrates the acceptance of direct sexual references is the inclusion of explicit sexual language in inscriptions or graffiti. While not always comedic, the everyday presence of such language on walls, vases, or even tombstones shows a cultural comfort with explicit terminology that extended beyond the theatre. You'd find a rude drawing of a phallus alongside a casual message, indicating a general lack of squeamishness about sexual imagery and language in public spaces. Now, for another quirky or fringe tidbit, some ancient Greek proverbs or folk sayings contained sexually explicit advice or humorous observations passed down orally. These often contained a blunt, earthy wisdom about human nature and its desires. Imagine a farmer offering a young man a piece of advice about love, couched in a crude but memorable saying, reflecting the folk wisdom about sexuality that existed outside of formal literature. The scholarly debate about the moral impact of this pervasive sexual humour is interesting. Historians still argue whether the constant exposure to explicit jokes and imagery in comedy led to a more permissive society, or if it merely served as a harmless pressure release valve that ultimately reinforced existing norms by making light of them. Did it lead to greater sexual freedom, or merely allow people to laugh at the very restrictions they lived under? You must remember that for the ancient Greeks, comedy, like tragedy, was a form of ritual, a way of engaging with profound human experiences, including sexuality, in a communal setting. The laughter wasn't just about amusement, it was about shared understanding, collective release, and a reaffirmation of the human condition, with all its messy, embarrassing, and undeniably sexual aspects. You wouldn't leave the theatre feeling ashamed, you'd leave feeling entertained, perhaps a little scandalised, but ultimately having participated in a cultural conversation about what it meant to be human. As you step out of the roaring theatre of Dionysus, the echoes of ancient laughter still ringing in your ears, you're left with a powerful understanding of how humour served as a vital, often bizarre outlet for ancient Greek sexual expression. Their comedy, with its outrageous costumes and explicit jokes, provided a unique public space for confronting, celebrating, and sometimes even normalising the most intimate aspects of their lives. It reminds us that laughter is a universal language, and that for the Greeks no subject, however scandalous, was truly off limits when it came to a good joke. From the boisterous laughter of the comedic stage, you now transition to a more serious, yet equally revealing arena. The legal and philosophical debates surrounding sexual conduct in ancient Greece. Forget simple black and white moral codes. Greek law and ethics concerning sexuality were remarkably complex, often contradictory, and deeply intertwined with social status, citizenship, and the pursuit of civic virtue. Imagine yourself in the hallowed halls of an Athenian law court, not a jury of your peers, but a vast assembly of male citizens listening intently as a prosecutor dissects a defendant's sexual life, not just for legal transgression, but for what it reveals about his character and his fitness as a citizen. You're about to discover how the most bizarre sexual practices, even if technically legal, could lead to public humiliation, legal challenges, and profound philosophical condemnation, shaping the very definition of who was considered a good Greek. The mainstream historical fact here is that ancient Greek law did not punish all forms of same-sex sexual activity, nor did it regulate private heterosexual acts between consenting adults in the same way modern laws might. Instead, legal concerns about sexuality primarily revolved around issues of social status, citizenship, public honour, and the protection of specific individuals, like citizen wives, daughters, and male youths. You'd find detailed laws concerning adultery, especially with a citizen wife, seduction, moicheia, prostitution, particularly for citizens, and the exploitation of freeborn boys. These laws were less about morality in a modern sense, and more about maintaining social order and male honour. Now for a quirky tidbit that might make you question their legal priorities. While rape of a free woman was a serious offence, the penalty for moicheia, adultery with a citizen wife, was often more severe, focusing on the violation of the husband's property rights and honour rather than the woman's bodily autonomy. Imagine a legal debate where the primary focus is not the victim's trauma, but the offended husband's perceived dishonour and the adulterer's disrespect for civic boundaries. It highlights a bizarre legal framework where property and social status often trumped individual bodily rights. The scholarly debate surrounding Greek sexual law often questions the extent to which these laws were truly enforced and how much they reflected aspirational ideals versus actual practice. Historians still argue whether the severe penalties for certain sexual offences were consistently applied, or if they served more as deterrents and rhetorical tools in legal speeches. Did these laws effectively regulate all sexual behaviour, or were they primarily used to punish political enemies or scapegoats? You can almost hear the ancient orators crafting their arguments, skillfully weaving legal precedents with moral condemnations and personal attacks, knowing that their opponent's sexual reputation could be their undoing. You must understand that a man's sexual conduct was inextricably linked to his civic identity and his sophrosin, self-control, moderation. While a wide range of sexual activities was permissible, a citizen was expected to maintain dignity and self-possession, especially in public. Excessive indulgence, acting in a passive sexual role, if an adult-free male, or engaging in sexual acts for money could all undermine his reputation, and, in extreme cases, lead to loss of civic rights, atimia. You'd find a man being publicly shamed or even legally penalised not for a sexual act itself, but for performing it in a way that violated the unwritten rules of civic propriety and masculine decorum. Consider the philosophical condemnations of certain sexual practices. While philosophers like Plato and Aristotle acknowledged various forms of eros, they often criticised excessive or unnatural desires, advocating for moderation and the pursuit of higher intellectual forms of love. Socrates, through Plato's dialogues, often directed pederastic desire towards the pursuit of wisdom rather than mere physical gratification. You'd find a philosopher arguing that while physical desire was natural, its unbridled pursuit could lead to moral degradation and prevent a man from achieving true virtue. This philosophical scrutiny added another layer of judgment beyond mere legality. The concept of hubris, excessive pride or arrogance, was sometimes applied to sexual conduct. A man who overtly flaunted his sexual conquests, or who sexually violated a person in a public and disrespectful manner, could be accused of hubris, leading to severe legal and social repercussions. This wasn't just about the sexual act, but about the disrespectful, arrogant manner in which it was performed, highlighting a bizarre connection between sexual behaviour and civic transgression. You'd find a wealthy man, accustomed to impunity, suddenly facing charges of hubris for a sexually aggressive act that challenged the community's sense of order. One mainstream historical fact that highlights the legal focus on ownership and lineage is that sexual offences were often viewed as property crimes, particularly when they involved women. A man's wife, daughter, or sister was considered under his guardianship, and any sexual violation of them was seen as a transgression against his honour and his property rights, not primarily as an assault on the woman's person. You'd find lawsuits meticulously detailing the financial implications of an adulterous act, or the damage done to a daughter's marriage prospects, a cold and pragmatic legalistic approach to intimate violations. Now for another quirky or fringe tidbit. Some ancient Greek rhetorical exercises, particularly those for aspiring orators, included detailed scenarios of bizarre sexual legal cases designed to challenge students to argue both for and against seemingly outrageous conduct. Imagine a young orator being tasked with defending a man accused of a highly unusual sexual act, forcing him to engage with the nuances of existing laws and societal prejudices, highlighting the legal system's attempts to grapple with the truly strange. It reveals how even fictional legal challenges push the boundaries of permissible discourse. The scholarly debate about the enforcement of laws against male prostitution is particularly interesting. Historians still argue whether the loss of civic rights for pornoi, male citizens who prostituted themselves, was primarily a punishment for selling one's body, or for taking the passive sexual role, which was deemed unmanly for a free citizen. Was the legal penalty aimed at the economic transaction, or the perceived gender transgression? This discussion highlights the subtle, often bizarre ways in which gender and sexuality were policed through the legal system. You must remember that the line between legal and socially acceptable was not always the same. An act might be technically legal, but still carry immense social stigma and shame. Conversely, a legally forbidden act might be widely practiced in secret. The bizarre in this context often existed in the grey areas between explicit prohibition and tacit disapproval, leading to a constant tension between private desires and public performance. You'd find people navigating these unspoken rules, carefully balancing their desires with their need to maintain their reputation. Consider the role of legal speeches as sources of information about bizarre sexual practices. Orators, in trying to discredit their opponents, would frequently dredge up rumours, accusations, or even past sexual indiscretions, often exaggerating or fabricating details to paint a picture of depravity. While these speeches cannot be taken as literal truth, they do reveal the types of sexual behaviours that were considered shocking, scandalous, or bizarre enough to damage a man's public standing. You'd listen to an orator weaving a vivid, often sensationalised narrative of his opponent's alleged sexual perversions, knowing that the goal was to ruin his credibility, not necessarily to prove literal facts. The concept of pollution, miasma, also extended to legal and philosophical discussions of sexual transgressions. Acts of incest, parricide, or other grave violations were believed to bring ritual defilement that could curse not just the individual, but the entire community. Legal proceedings often incorporated purification rituals, highlighting the religious dimension of their legal system. You'd find a community holding public purifications after a scandalous trial, believing it necessary to cleanse the city from the taint of sexual deviance. One mainstream historical fact that illustrates a peculiar legal and social control over sexual bodies is the infamous law against defaming citizens, e.g., in a public speech or comedy, by calling them male prostitutes, pornoi, if they were not actually prostitutes, while it was permissible to refer to actual prostitutes this way. Falsely accusing a citizen carried legal penalties. This highlights the bizarre tension between the open acceptance of male prostitution for non-citizens and the zealous protection of citizen male honour from such a degrading label. Now, for another quirky or fringe tidbit, some ancient Greek curses and defixiones, curse tablets, invoke deities to cause impotence or sexual dysfunction in enemies. While not a legal punishment, these magical interventions reveal a belief in the ability to inflict bizarre sexual misfortunes through supernatural means. Imagine an individual secretly burying a lead tablet inscribed with a curse, hoping to make their rival impotent or sexually unattractive, a dark and intimate form of revenge. The scholarly debate about the sexuality of Greek law is ongoing. Historians still argue whether the emphasis on male honour and property rights in sexual matters represents a unique form of sexual politics, or simply reflects broader patriarchal structures common in ancient societies. Was their legal approach to sexuality truly distinct, or just a variation on a familiar theme of male control? You must remember that for the ancient Greeks, law and philosophy were not abstract concepts separate from daily life. They were living systems that constantly grappled with the complexities of human behaviour, including its most intimate and sometimes bizarre manifestations. The punishments, the condemnations, and the very structure of their arguments reveal a continuous effort to define the boundaries of acceptable desire and to maintain a fragile social order in the face of ever-present human passions. As you conclude your journey through the legal and philosophical landscape of ancient Greek sexuality, leaving behind the heated courtroom debates and the abstract ethical discussions, you're left with a powerful understanding of how deeply embedded bizarre sexual practices were in their attempts to define and control desire. Their laws and philosophies, however imperfect or contradictory, reveal a society grappling with the raw realities of human intimacy, often finding themselves forced to categorize, judge, and ultimately live with the full unsettling spectrum of human sexual expression. From the intricate legal and philosophical debates surrounding sexual conduct, you now delve into an even more elusive and profoundly personal aspect of ancient Greek intimate life: dreams, omens, and superstitions related to sexuality. Forget rigid scientific explanations. This was a world where the boundary between the conscious and unconscious, the mundane and the supernatural was permeable, and where inexplicable desires or strange encounters could be interpreted as messages from the gods, portents of fortune, or warnings of ill omen. Imagine a Greek individual waking from a vivid, perhaps unsettling dream filled with erotic imagery, immediately seeking out an interpreter or a priest to decipher its hidden meaning. You're about to discover how the most bizarre sexual experiences, even those confined to the realm of the subconscious, could profoundly shape daily decisions and instill both hope and fear in the ancient Greek mind. The mainstream historical fact here is that dreams, particularly those with strong or unusual sexual content, were widely believed to be significant omens or messages from the gods in ancient Greece. Dream interpretation was a recognized practice, and specialized interpreters, or neurokratai, would offer guidance on their meaning, often linking them to one's future health, fertility, social standing, or even impending disaster. You'd find individuals meticulously recalling their nocturnal visions, eager to understand if a dream of a particular sexual act foretold good fortune or warned of impending misfortune, reflecting a deep-seated belief in the divine origins of subconscious experiences. Now for a quirky tidbit that might make you reconsider ancient Greek sleep patterns. Some ancient medical texts advised patients suffering from certain ailments to sleep on the skin of a freshly sacrificed animal, believing that the animal's spiritual essence would transfer to the sleeper and induce specific, often curative or prophetic dreams. Imagine a patient, desperate for a cure, spending a night wrapped in a sheepskin, hoping that the bizarre ritual would bring forth a dream offering divine insight into their sexual or physical health. It highlights a fascinating, if somewhat grotesque, blend of superstition and desperate medical hope. The scholarly debate surrounding dream interpretation often questions the extent to which these interpretations were standardized, or how much they varied based on the interpreter's skill, the dreamer's status, or the specific cultural context. Historians still argue whether the erotic content of dreams was always seen as a literal prophecy, or if it was more often symbolic of broader themes like fertility, power, or vulnerability. Were these interpretations truly insightful, or merely convenient explanations tailored to the dreamer's anxieties? You can almost hear the ancient dream interpreters, with a knowing look, offering ambiguous readings that allowed for multiple possibilities. You must understand that for the ancient Greeks, the gods were omnipresent and could communicate through various subtle channels, including dreams. The distinction between human thought and divine inspiration was often blurred. Therefore, a sexually charged dream was not necessarily a mere product of the individual's mind. It could be a direct intrusion of the divine into one's consciousness, carrying profound implications for one's intimate life and future. You'd find a person meticulously recounting a dream of intimacy with a god, believing it to be a direct blessing or a divine summons. Consider the role of omens and portents in daily sexual life. Beyond dreams, strange animal behaviours, unusual weather phenomena, or even accidental spills could be interpreted as omens related to sexual matters, particularly fertility and marriage. A sudden flock of doves flying into one's house might be a good omen for a marriage proposal, while a snake found in the marital bed might be a dire warning about infidelity or barrenness. You'd find people constantly observing their surroundings, seeking subtle signs that could reveal the divine will regarding their intimate relationships. The belief in aphrodisiacs and love charms also highlights a form of bizarre superstition related to sexuality. People used various herbs, animal parts, or magical concoctions believed to enhance sexual desire, induce love, or even compel someone to fall in love. While not always effective, the widespread use of such charms speaks to a deep belief in influencing intimate outcomes through magical means. You'd find a lovelorn individual secretly preparing a potion from strange ingredients, perhaps reciting an incantation, hoping to magically ignite passion in their beloved, a desperate and often clandestine act. One mainstream historical fact that illustrates the dark side of sexual superstition is the use of curse tablets, defixions, to inflict sexual misfortune on rivals or enemies. These lead tablets, often inscribed with curses invoking chthonic deities, might wish for impotence, barrenness, or sexual rejection upon a specific individual. You'd find a wronged lover or a jealous rival secretly burying a curse tablet, hoping to wreak havoc on their enemy's intimate life, revealing a sinister and deeply personal form of magical warfare. Now, for another quirky or fringe tidbit, some ancient Greek magical papyri contain instructions for creating binding spells that literally aim to bind someone's sexual organs, preventing them from engaging in intercourse with anyone else, or conversely forcing them into sexual submission. Imagine a detailed magical ritual, perhaps involving intricate knots or symbolic figurines, designed to control another person's sexual will, a truly bizarre and disturbing application of superstition to intimate autonomy. The scholarly debate about the efficacy and psychological impact of these superstitions is fascinating. Historians still argue whether individuals truly believed in the literal power of these charms and curses, or if they served more as psychological tools, reinforcing hope or projecting blame in an uncertain world. Did these bizarre practices actually influence sexual outcomes, or were their effects primarily psychosomatic, reflecting the power of belief? You must understand that the ancient Greeks lived in a world where magic and divine intervention were considered real and potent forces. They didn't have a scientific understanding of psychology or physiology as we do today. Therefore, attributing sexual problems or desires to supernatural causes, or attempting to influence them through magical means, was a logical, if sometimes bizarre, response to the mysteries of human intimacy. You'd find a person consulting a sorceress for a love potion, as readily as they might consult a doctor for an illness. Consider the fear of impotence or barrenness and its link to curses or divine disfavour. For a man, impotence was a profound source of shame, potentially linked to a rival's curse or an offended deity. For a woman, barrenness could lead to divorce or social ostracization, often attributed to divine displeasure or malevolent magic. This fear fueled a market for countercharms, fertility rituals, and desperate appeals to gods like Aphrodite or Priapus. You'd find a couple struggling to conceive, seeking out a priest or a magical practitioner, desperately trying to undo what they believe to be a curse on their fertility. The interpretation of animal symbolism in dreams and omens often had sexual connotations. Animals associated with fertility, like rabbits or goats, appearing in a dream might be a positive omen for procreation, while predatory animals could symbolize sexual aggression or danger. This symbolic language was deeply embedded in their cultural consciousness. You'd dream of a magnificent bull and immediately think of Zeus's amorous exploits, interpreting it as a sign of impending passion or an encounter with a powerful, dominant figure. One mainstream historical fact that showcases the pervasive nature of these beliefs is the use of specific rituals before marriage or during childbirth to ward off evil spirits or negative sexual influences. These rituals, often involving symbolic purifications, offerings, or protective amulets, aim to ensure a blessed and fertile union, free from malevolent interference. You'd find a young bride participating in elaborate pre-wedding rituals, perhaps involving strange dances or the wearing of peculiar charms, all intended to protect her from curses on her fertility or sexual harmony. Now, for another quirky or fringe tidbit, there are some very rare references to rituals involving the consumption of animal organs, particularly reproductive organs, believed to transfer virility or fertility to the consumer. Imagine a ritual where individuals would consume parts of an animal's testes or uterus, believing it would directly imbue them with heightened sexual power or reproductive capability. It's a primal, visceral belief in sympathetic magic, pushing the boundaries of what constitutes an intimate encounter with the divine or the animalistic. The scholarly debate about the psychological impact of these beliefs is complex. Historians still argue whether the constant awareness of omens and curses created a climate of anxiety and paranoia regarding sexuality, or if it provided a framework for understanding and coping with inexplicable events in their intimate lives. Did it foster fear, or provide a sense of control in a chaotic world? You must remember that for the ancient Greeks, the line between the natural world and the supernatural was fluid. Dreams, omens, and superstitions were not seen as separate from real life. They were integral to it, offering explanations for inexplicable desires, sudden misfortunes, and the mysterious forces that governed human intimacy. The bizarre in this context was simply a manifestation of forces beyond direct human control, requiring propitiation, interpretation, or magical intervention. Even in literature, poets and playwrights often incorporated dreams and omens with sexual themes to advance plots, foreshadow events, or reveal characters' inner anxieties. These literary devices reflect the widespread cultural belief in the significance of such phenomena. You'd read a tragic play where a character's dream of an incestuous union foreshadows their doom, or a comedic play where a dream of a bizarre sexual encounter leads to hilarious misunderstandings, showcasing the power of the subconscious in their narrative traditions. As you conclude your exploration of dreams, omens, and superstitions related to ancient Greek sexuality, leaving behind the hushed whispers of dream interpreters and the dark allure of curse tablets, you are left with a powerful understanding of how deeply spiritual and magical beliefs permeated the most intimate aspects of their lives. The bizarre practices, whether interpreting strange dreams or casting dark spells, reveal a culture that sought to understand and influence the unpredictable forces that governed human desire and fate, forever blurring the lines between the mundane and the mysteriously divine.